Hi guys and welcome to Quiet History Vault. Tonight we slip into a world of rattling wagon wheels, wet wool wood smoke and raw ambition, where the ground itself seems to whisper that fortune is only one pan away. You can almost feel the cold dawn on your cheeks as you stand at the edge of a mining trail. Boots already damp, hands already sore, hearts still foolishly hopeful. It all sounds thrilling at first, does it not? Gold in the river, mountains in the distance, a future remade by one lucky scoop. And yet very quickly, the fantasy develops blisters. This is the sort of place where a man can cross an ocean chasing wealth and lose his blanket, his teeth, and his last bit of pride before breakfast. In other words, you probably will not survive this with your dignity fully intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time. Now dim the lights. You arrive too late for innocence, but just early enough for trouble. The first thing that greets you is not gold, not glory, not even some heroic tableau of rugged adventurers bathed in sunrise. It is noise. Carts creak, mules snort, men cough into the cold air with the deep chesty sound of people who have swallowed too much dust and too little hope. Somewhere nearby, bacon spits in a pan, which would be encouraging if you were the one about to eat it. Instead, you stand on a road that is less road than argument between mud and stone, looking toward a camp that has sprung up in a place no sensible town planner would have picked, unless possessed by greed or a vivid grudge against comfort. This is the great truth of gold rush life. The dream arrives first in newspapers, rumours and tavern talk. The reality appears later, smelling faintly of damp canvas horse sweat and old beans. You have heard the stories already. Everybody has. In 1848, gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill in California, and within a year the news ripples outward with astonishing speed. By 1849, thousands are on the move, the famous 49ers, though many will continue arriving long after that neat label has stopped being accurate. That is the mainstream fact people remember. They picture eager prospectors marching west with pans over their shoulders and sunlight in their eyes. What they do not always picture is what happens when all those eager bodies need roads, food or water, shelter, and a place to relieve themselves. History can be like that. It loves the sparkle and sometimes quietly steps over the chamber pot. So you come on anyway, because of course you do. Perhaps you have left a farm that barely feeds you. Perhaps a shop failed. Perhaps you were respectable once or nearly respectable, and now the idea of reinventing yourself among strangers feels better than staying where everyone knows exactly how ordinary you are. Gold rushes attract many kinds of people, but one type is especially common, the person who cannot bear the thought that someone else might become rich while he stays put polishing the same old disappointment. The journey has already thinned you out. Whether you have come overland through harsh country or by sea and then inland through rough terrain, you do not glide into camp like a conquering hero. You stagger in, your clothes are stiff with dirt. Your back aches in layers. Your fingers have gone numb more than once. If you came with fine luggage and urban habits, the trail has introduced them to one another in the worst possible way. Even your reflection, if you happen to catch it in a still puddle, would look like a man being slowly edited by hardship. And still beneath all that fatigue there is excitement. It flickers stubbornly. That is what makes this world so compelling. You are miserable, but you are also electrified. Every stranger you pass seems to carry a rumour. Someone found a promising stretch upstream. Someone else pulled a nugget the size of a walnut. A third man swears a fellow in the next valley made enough in a week to buy land back east and retire before his boots wore through. Gold rush camps run on gossip the way furnaces run on coal. Without stories of sudden fortune, the whole enterprise might collapse under the weight of its own wet socks. There is even the occasional wonderfully strange tidbit that makes the place feel half real and half fever dream. In some camps, men carried eggs with absurd care, because fresh ones could become luxury goods. Imagine that. Not jewels, not silk, not imported perfume. Eggs. Fragile little ovals treated like treasure, sometimes packed in bran or wrapped so carefully you would think they were royal infants. In a place where the basic routines of life have broken apart, ordinary things become exotic. A clean shirt can feel aristocratic. A pie can seem nearly mythic. You move closer to the camp and begin taking it in piece by piece. Canvas tents flap in the breeze like tired flags. Rough timber shacks lean at angles that inspire absolutely no faith. Laundry hangs where it can. Fire smoke drifts low and catches in the throat. The ground underfoot is churned to a brown paste in some places, baked hard in others. You hear accents from everywhere. New York, Missouri, London, Canton, Sydney, Santiago. The gold rush is not just a local event. It is a human funnel. People pour in from across the globe, dragged by the same bright rumour, each convinced that luck might finally make an exception in their favour. And there is something almost tender in that hope, is there not? Tired, foolish, magnificent hope. You see it in the way men straighten when they mention a crick by name. You hear it in the cheerful lies they tell one another at dusk. Tomorrow will be better. The next claim will be richer. The bad stretch was only temporary. The weather will improve. Prices will settle. My hands will toughen. My luck will turn. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. Gold rush life feeds on tomorrow. Yet the camp itself whispers another message, one much less romantic. It tells you that fortune here is a narrow door and everyone is trying to squeeze through it at once. The easiest ground may already be taken. The best claims may belong to men who arrived earlier, knew someone important, or simply got lucky before you did. Historians still argue whether the true engine of these camps was independent ambition or the rapid creation of new hierarchies that favoured the already advantaged. You can feel both possibilities at once as you stand there. The place promises freedom, but it also begins sorting winners and losers almost immediately. And that sorting starts with the body. Can you carry enough? Can you work through hunger? Can you sleep in noise? Can you tolerate smells that seem to stick to your hair, your blanket, your very thoughts? Can you keep moving when your feet blister and crack? Most people like to imagine that success comes down to courage or cleverness. Gold rush camps offer a ruder lesson. Sometimes it comes down to whether your stomach can handle bad pork and whether your back gives out before the river does. So you take another step, then another into the settlement that will soon become your whole world. Behind you lies the journey. Ahead of you lies the camp itself, sprawling and temporary and strangely hungry, as if it feeds not only on the earth, but on the people who come to scrape at it. The fantasy has not vanished yet. It is still there, glittering just beyond reach. But now another truth walks beside it, quieter and far more durable. Whatever you hope to find here, you will first have to endure the road, the crowd, the prices, the cold mornings, and the humiliating discovery that gold is rarely the first thing a mining camp takes from you. Usually that honour belongs to comfort. You learn that the last stretch into a gold camp is often the meanest part, as if the land wants one final laugh before allowing you into its little kingdom of smoke and disappointment. The trail narrows, then breaks apart, then pretends to be a path again. It is rutted where wagons have chewed it open slick, where rain has turned the earth to paste and hard as fired brick, where the sun has baked yesterday's misery into shape. Your boots sink, slide, scrape, and complain in their own language. By now your shoulders feel as though someone has quietly replaced your bones with rope. The odd thing is that everyone around you still looks mildly hopeful, which tells you something important about human beings. Put enough desperation into a crowd, add a rumour of buried wealth, and people will treat suffering like a temporary inconvenience instead of the main feature. Men limp onward, clutching sacks, pans, picks, or rolled blankets, frying tins, coffee pots, and absurd dreams of becoming gentlemen by Christmas. A few women travel too, carrying children, bundles, and the extra burden of moving through a world designed by men who think hardship is noble when someone else shares it. The sounds of the road stay with you. Wheels grind against stone. Leather harness straps creak with every pull. Somewhere a mule lets out a noise of such personal insult that it seems to summarize the entire overland experience. Coughing rises from the line of travellers in little bursts, joined by muttered, swearing low conversation and this clink of metal tools knocking together. The smell is just as crowded. Wet wool, horse dung smoke from green wood, stale grease, unwashed bodies, and the mineral smell of mud itself all combine into something powerful enough to seem almost visible. You keep moving because stopping has its own dangers. If you fall behind, you lose space in line at ferries, trail crossings, supply wagons, and campsite clearings. If you pause too long, someone else may buy the last decent sack of flour from the peddler ahead. If you lag near dusk, you risk bedding down in a miserable patch where the wind snakes straight through your blankets and the ground pokes you in all the places nature forgot to pad. The road teaches speed but not elegance. Nobody on this trail is elegant anymore. One solid historical truth hangs over all this movement. During the Great California Rush and other 19th century mining booms, many routes were so crowded and poorly supplied that travellers routinely lost animals, wagons, equipment, and sometimes their health long before reaching the diggings. That practical collapse is less famous than the golden fantasy, but it matters more. The road acts like a silent filter. It takes money from the underprepared, strength from the overconfident, and patience from nearly everyone. There are small indignities too, the kind history books politely step around. You discover that clothing begins to fail at the exact moment you most need it. Seams pull apart, soles thin, buttons vanish, hats lose shape and become damp, tragic things. A man who left home looking respectable can arrive at camp appearing like a scarecrow with emotional damage. Even your blanket starts to smell like the whole continent has passed through it. You wrap yourself in it anyway at night because pride is warm for almost no one. Food on the trail becomes both precious and slightly insulting. Salt pork sweats in paper. Biscuits crumble into powder at the bottom of sacks. Coffee, when you can manage it, tastes burnt, bitter, and glorious. Sometimes all you want is an apple, a clean cup of water, and one day in which nothing leaks. Instead, supper is whatever survives, being carried, dropped, rained on, or traded. There were travellers who baked bread in camp kettles, fried dough in salvaged grease, or boiled nearly anything into a stew, simply because chewing felt too ambitious by evening. You begin to understand how quickly appetite narrows into function. You stop asking whether the meal is enjoyable. You ask whether it will keep you upright until dawn. And then there are the little roadside economies, those ingenious pockets of opportunism that bloom wherever tired people gather. A person selling nail socks, lamp oil, or a heel of cheese can charge a shocking sum because need has no bargaining power. One quirky detail from several gold routes is that simple transport services, especially river crossings or pack hauling over difficult sections, could become tiny fortunes for those running them. Not because the work was elegant, but because every exhausted traveller eventually reaches the point where paying too much feels wiser than collapsing theatrically into the mud. You watch tempers fray as the miles pass. Men argue over space, over rations, over whether someone's mule is wandering over whose wagon blocked the crossing, over who borrowed a shovel and returned it bent. These are not grand dramatic disputes. They are petty, tired, deeply human quarrels sharpened by hunger and the endless abrasion of discomfort. A trail like this does not simply transport people, it rubs them raw. Even kindness becomes a physical effort. Yet now and then you see it anyway. Someone shares coffee, someone helps right a cart, someone gives directions to a spring that has not dried up yet. Civilization survives in fragments tucked between complaints. At night the road grows stranger. Campfires dot the darkness in uneven clusters, each one a tiny orange claim against the vast black around it. Sparks lift and vanish. Blankets rustle. A baby cries somewhere thin and tired. Men tell stories they have heard from other men who heard them from someone completely unreliable, which is to say most of Gold Rush knowledge. There are tales of streams lined with nuggets of abandoned claims richer than any bank vault of ghosts, thieves' mountain lions, and one alarming rumour about a pack animal that supposedly learned to untie knots better than its owner. Sleep comes in scraps interrupted by cold snores and the occasional dreadful realisation that a rock has been pressing into your hip for hours. Scholars continue to dispute whether the road itself should be understood mainly as a proving ground that forged mining culture, or as a traumatic prelude that left many migrants already weakened before the real work even began. You can feel the sense in both views. The journey does toughen you in a bleak and unglamorous way. It teaches you to carry less complain more quietly and notice where water sits in the land. But it also drains you. By the time the camp comes into reach, some portion of your original confidence has already been spent. What the road takes most efficiently is illusion. Back home, it may have been easy to imagine gold seeking as a kind of outdoor adventure with profits attached. Out here, the body corrects that fantasy hour by hour. Your feet pulse, your hands chap, your neck burns in the sun, then chills after dark. Dust settles into your mouth until your own tongue feels borrowed. Rain can arrive and turn every possession heavy. Heat can press down until thought itself becomes slow and sticky. The landscape does not care that you had plans. Still, the camp ahead draws you onward as smoke rises over the trees. Somewhere beyond those rough structures, men are already digging, washing gravel, and studying the bottoms of pans with the intensity of priests reading omens. The sight stirs you again. This is the magic and the trap. Misery seems almost worth it when the promise returns to view. Perhaps the road has only tested you. Perhaps your luck starts now. Perhaps all this exhaustion is the price of admission and nothing more. So you straighten your back as much as it will allow. You shift the weight on your shoulder. You step around a broken wheel, a patch of churned muck. A man sitting by the roadside with the blank stare of someone reconsidering every choice that brought him west. Then you press on. The trail behind you is already full of dropped objects, broken plans, and people moving more slowly than they admit. The camp in front of you looks crude, noisy, improvised, and somehow magnetic. You know better than to trust appearances now, but you follow it anyway, because the road that eats men also teaches them one final lesson. Once you have suffered this much to arrive, turning back feels harder than going in. By the time you reach the edge of the camp, your expectations have already been reduced to a humble little bundle. A dry place to sit. A cup of something warm. Perhaps a patch of ground, not actively trying to injure you. Gold at this precise moment has drifted slightly down the list. That is the first quiet joke the mining camp plays on you. It teaches you that survival arrives before ambition and comfort before glory, if comfort can be found at all. From a distance, the place looked almost festive in that reckless way. Anything can seem lively when smoke rises and people cluster with purpose. Up close, it is a rough sprawl of tents, lean-to shelters, timber huts, cooking fires, laundry lines, tool piles, and half-completed structures that appear to have been assembled during an argument. Nothing lines up neatly. Paths curl between dwellings where feet have worn the earth down. Mud sits in low places. Refuse collects where nobody has had enough energy to move it farther. The camp does not seem built so much as flung together by urgency. The first impression is movement. Men push past carrying pans, shovels, picks, sacks of flour, split wood, and dented kettles. A child darts between them with the confidence of someone who has already accepted chaos as natural law. Dogs nose at scraps. Mules stamp and flick their tails. A wagon lurches through, slowly, one wheel protesting with a high wooden squeal. Somewhere close by, a hammer knocks against a board again and again with such dogged rhythm that it begins to sound like the heartbeat of the place. Then comes the noise layered beneath the noise. Coughing, laughter, a short burst of anger, tin plates clattering, water sloshing into buckets. A violin being tuned badly, then played with complete confidence anyway. Someone calls out prices for bread, boots, tobacco or coffee. Someone else announces news from another claim, another creek, another valley, where fortune is always just slightly better than here. A mining camp is never silent unless it is dead, and even then the wind tends to have an opinion. The smell is its own education. Wood smoke lies over everything like a blanket that no one asked for. Beneath it you catch bacon, grease-wet canvas horse sweat, damp earth, stale liquor, muddy boots, and the faint metallic scent of disturbed ground. If the sun has warmed the day, there is also that thick human smell of too many bodies living too close together, without the luxury of regular bathing. You realise almost at once that privacy is not the only thing you will lack here. So is fresh air. One central fact of many gold rush settlements is that they grew with astonishing speed and very little planning. Camps could appear in weeks when a strike was reported, expanding faster than road sanitation or law could keep pace. That frantic growth is what you are seeing all around you. The camp is less a town than a reaction. It is the physical shape of a rumour becoming crowded. You walk farther in and the visual details start collecting like evidence. Some tents are patched with flour sacks or old sailcloth. Some cabins are no more than poles, planks, and confidence. One structure leans at such a dramatic angle that you cannot tell whether it is standing or remembering better days. Laundry hangs from ropes in uneven rows, shirts stiff with washing water, flap beside socks, petticoats and long underwear, all of it carrying the public intimacy of camp life. Your own life, you sense, will soon join that exhibition whether you like it or not. The faces around you tell another story. There is every age from near boys to men with grey in their beards and sorrow in their shoulders. Some look newly arrived eyes, bright movements, quick clothes still holding a faint memory of civilization. Others have that worn, narrowed look produced by weeks or months of hard labour. Poor sleep and optimism rationed very carefully. Their hands are nicked, stained and swollen. Their boots are caked. Their eyes flick toward newcomers with the mild appraisal of people asking a practical question. Will this one last? Women are fewer, but very much present, and the camp notices them in ways both obvious and tiresome. Some run boarding houses, cook shops, laundry businesses, or small stores. Some travel with husbands or families. Some are simply trying to survive in a place that treats female presence as unusual and therefore maddeningly public property. You notice the way conversations shift when a woman passes, how curiosity, respect, awkwardness and foolishness can all fit into one glance. The camp is a world shaped by men but never entirely controlled by them. You also start hearing languages you cannot place at first. Spanish near one fire, Cantonese near another, French spoken quickly by two men unloading gear, English in several varieties, each insisting it is the correct one. This surprises people who imagine mining camps as purely local or purely national affairs. In truth, many were global crossroads jammed with migrants from different continents who brought not only labour but foodways, skills, customs, music and rivalries. The camp is dirty, yes, and loud, yes, but it's also oddly cosmopolitan in the least polished setting imaginable. And then, because gold rush life never allows the strange to wait politely, you encounter one of those camp tidbits that feels too peculiar to be true and yet certainly is. In more than one mining settlement, enterprising people charged money for simple entertainment such as trained animal acts, puppet shows, or makeshift theatre performances carried out in canvas halls. Imagine arriving filthy and exhausted only to find a monkey in a tiny costume or a melodrama being performed 3 tents over from a muddy trench. Human beings, it turns out, will build amusement almost anywhere, even on top of disappointment. Still, your attention keeps returning to the geography of the camp itself. The richest claims may lie beyond, but here is where the emotional economy runs. Here men boast, borrow, argue, celebrate, recover and fail. Here a lucky strike becomes a story by supper. Here a bad week becomes silence. Here the newly hopeful meet the already disenchanted. There is no grand gateway marking your entrance, no formal welcome, no kindly clerk handing over a useful guide titled So you have chosen dust and uncertainty. The camp simply absorbs you and almost immediately begins testing how much discomfort you can normalize. You look for order and find only fragments of it. A row of supply tents here, a cluster of cook fires there, a store made of planks, a saloon improvised from canvas and volume, a blacksmith corner with tools shattered like iron bones. Beyond that, sleeping areas, wagons, lines of men, waiting knots of men bargaining, knots of men pretending not to eavesdrop. The whole place feels temporary even when people have already begun trying to make it permanent. That tension hangs in the air. Everyone acts as though they are building a future, yet most structures suggest they were erected for a very long week. Researchers still debate whether mining camps should be seen chiefly as chaotic frontier settlements or as rapidly forming communities with their own surprisingly stable norms and routines. Standing there, you can understand the disagreement. The camp looks unruly enough to collapse in a strong wind, yet beneath the mess you can already feel patterns taking shape. Who sells what, who sleeps where, who gets listened to, who gets ignored. Chaos, yes, but organised as chaos, which is still chaos with a ledger. You pass a notice nailed crookedly to a board. Another man is reading it with intense concentration, though whether he is studying the rules or simply grateful to look at words again is hard to say. Nearby, someone is frying something in grease dark enough to have a biography. The smell catches you by the stomach. You're hungry, tired, overstimulated, slightly alarmed, and yet a part of you is thrilled. This rough maze is now the centre of your world, because for all its ugliness, the camp possesses a dangerous kind of energy. It hums with possibility. Every muddy boot might belong to a man who struck lucky yesterday. Every broken-down stranger might still become tomorrow's success story. Every pan, every shovel, every sack of gravel being hauled through these winding paths seems attached to the same question. What if the next try works? So you stand there for one quiet moment amid the racket, smelling smoke and wet timber, hearing voices rise and fall, feeling the ground uneven beneath your sore feet. The dream has not vanished. It has simply changed shape. It no longer gleams from far away like a clean fantasy. It sits here in the grime, tangled up with noise and mess and the alarming number of things that can rot. And as you take your first real steps into the camp, one truth settles over you as steadily as the smoke. This place is not built to welcome you, it is built to use you. That becomes painfully clear the first time you try to buy anything. You arrive with sore feet, smoky clothes, and the last stubborn scraps of your optimism, and the camp decides to introduce itself through arithmetic. Not elegant arithmetic, naturally. This is not the tidy sort done by clerks with inked cuffs. This is the kind scratched onto crate lids, muttered over counters, and delivered with a face suggesting that if you do not like the figure, the wilderness remains available to you free of charge. You ask the price of flour and nearly laugh, except no one else is laughing. You ask about bacon beans, coffee candles, boots, soap, a blanket, maybe a shovel. If yours has already begun to resemble modern art, and with each answer, you feel your wallet thinning in advance. Gold Rush camps have a blunt lesson to teach, and they teach it immediately. Their people swinging picks are not always the people making money. That was true in a great many rushes, especially in California and later boom regions where merchants transport operators, boarding house keepers, saloon owners and suppliers often earned steadier profits than the miners risking the sourdough backs in riverbeds and shafts. It is one of the most reliable facts in this entire world of rumour. Plenty of hopeful prospectors discovered too late that the most dependable gold was extracted not from the ground, but from the hungry, cold, overconfident men trying to dig it up. You step into a store that is really a plank room with ambitions. Barrels stand open. Crates are stacked against rough walls. Tobacco hangs in twists. Shovels lean in a corner. There are sacks of meal, coils of rope, lanterns, cups, tin plates, dried apples, nails, lamp oil, socks, and those little practical objects that become almost sacred when you have gone without them. The air inside is dusty, close and fragrant with coffee, leather molasses, and old wood. It smells like necessity. Behind the counter stands a man who has mastered the frontier expression of polite indifference. He does not need to charm you. He does not need to flatter you. He has goods, and you need goods, and the mountain has not seen fit to provide a competing grocer around the bend. He tells you the cost of coffee, then the cost of boots, then the cost of a frying pan. Each number lands with the soft force of a hammer wrapped in cloth. You realise that the camp does not merely exploit need, it studies it. You begin doing those strange little mental calculations people perform when tired and alarmed. Could you manage without sugar? Probably. Without fresh socks? Less wise. Without soap? Briefly. Perhaps, though your future tent mates may form opinions, without a better blanket. The coming nights may decide for you. Every purchase feels like surrender. Every coin handed over seems to say that your dream now belongs partly to someone else. And the worst part is that many of these prices make a kind of brutal sense. Everything has to be brought in. Transport is difficult, roads are poor, weather interferes, animals die, wagons break, theft happens, and demand is absurd. So the inflated cost is not always pure greed, though greed is certainly keeping excellent company. A barrel of flour that would seem ordinary elsewhere becomes something almost ceremonial here. A box of candles might as well arrive on velvet. Need distance and uncertainty all gather in the final price. There is also the constant emotional irritation of watching your money leave before your mining has even begun in earnest. You did not come all this way to enrich a man selling pick handles and stale crackers, yet here you are doing exactly that. Around you other miners stand with the same pinched look weighing purchases as if each one were a confession. One buys tobacco instead of socks because morale counts for something. Another chooses beans over coffee because the stomach, unlike the spirit, tends to win practical arguments. A third stares at a pair of gloves long enough to suggest that his hands have already had a difficult conversation with the cold. One wonderfully odd detail from some camps is that eggs, milk, and fresh vegetables could become luxuries so extravagant they sounded almost fictional in conversation. A miner might speak of a cabbage or a dozen eggs in the tone another man reserved for silverware or opera tickets. It feels faintly ridiculous until you remember how far food must travel, how quickly it spoils, and how hard the body works here. Suddenly an onion has glamour, a peach becomes poetry. Outside the store, prices continue to shape the camp's whole rhythm. Board costs money, laundry costs money, a hot meal costs money, repairing tools cost money. Water can cost money if someone has organised access to it cleverly enough. Even the privilege of sleeping indoors where wind and rain are slightly less intimate may be priced beyond what many can manage for long, so people improvise. They crowd together in tents, patch old clothes, stretch meals, borrow tools, share fires, and make little economies out of scraps and luck. This is where the camp starts sorting people not by bravery but by cushion. Men with more capital who can buy sturdier gear, secure better shelter, replace broken tools and survive a bad week. Men without it are always one setback from unravelling. A ripped boot, a lost shovel, a stolen sack of flour one feverish afternoon that keeps you from working and suddenly your margin disappears. Some historians contend that mining camps rewarded grit above all else. Others point out with very little romance that grit is more effective when paired with enough money to absorb a setback or two. From where you stand smelling salt pork and sawdust, the second view looks rather convincing. You notice too that merchants cultivate a particular kind of authority. Not official authority exactly, not the sort with uniforms or seals, but the daily kind that matters just as much. They know who owes whom. They know who has struck a little gold and who has been faking confidence for 3 weeks. They know who is likely to pay cash, who wants credit, who may vanish by dawn, and who is one bad hand of cards away from selling his shovel. In a place obsessed with buried wealth, the storekeeper often knows more about actual value than the miners do. Some camp stores also become little social theatres. News travels through them. So do rumours, grievances, flirtations, warnings, and elaborate lies. Men enter to buy nails and emerge. Having learnt that a creek to the north is supposedly richer, that someone downstream has been salting a claim that a boarding tent serves edible stew on Tuesdays, and that a dentist has arrived, which is either a blessing or a threat depending on your current relationship with your molars. In this way, commerce becomes conversation, and conversation becomes another commodity passed around with the coffee sacks. There is even a persistent academic disagreement over how exploitative these camp economies truly were. Some researchers emphasize raw opportunism, arguing that merchants and service providers squeezed desperate miners with almost theatrical ruthlessness. Others note that supply chains were unstable enough to justify at least some of the shocking prices, and that storekeepers themselves faced risk theft, spoilage, and transport loss. Both are probably true, which is annoyingly realistic. Frontier life rarely offers tidy villains twirling moustaches over barrels of beans. More often it produces ordinary people taking full advantage of extraordinary need. You leave the store carrying less than you want and having spent more than you intended. Your new supplies feel heavier because of what they cost. The sack cuts into your palm. The tin cup knocks softly against a wrapped parcel of bacon. A small paper twist of coffee, absurdly precious, sits near your elbow, like contraband from a better world. You're not yet mining, but the camp has already started extracting value from you with impressive efficiency, and that extraction is emotional as much as financial. You now understand that success here will require not one lucky moment, but 1,000 small negotiations with discomfort. You will have to choose continually between want and need, between short-term relief and longer survival. A hot meal now, or money saved for tools. Better boots or credit kept for flour. A place in news, or enough cash left to keep prospecting one more week. This is not the clean frontier saga of legend. It is budgeting with blisters. As evening edges in light catches the rough boards of the shops and tents turnishing the camp briefly amber through the smoke. Men drift toward cook fires and counters with the defeated focus of people who know tomorrow will cost them again. You look around and finally grasp the cruel cleverness of the place. Even before the river has decided whether to reward your labour, the camp has already begun collecting its share. Gold may be hidden in the earth, but your money, very inconveniently, is hidden in everyone else's till. By morning, the camp stops feeling like a spectacle and starts feeling like a machine, and now you are expected to become one of its moving parts. The day begins in the dark, or something very close to it. A grey chill sits over everything. Canvas walls sweat with condensation. Ash from last night's fire gives off that faint, sleepy smell of spent smoke and damp wood. You wake not because you're refreshed, which would be a charming fantasy, but because the camp around you has already begun to stir. Someone coughs hard enough to sound hollow. Someone else knocks over a tin cup. Boots scrape. A mule objects to existence. The whole place seems to groan itself awake. You pull on clothes that never quite dried properly. The fabric is stiff at the seams and cool against your skin. Your fingers fumble because they are still numb. You can feel yesterday in your shoulders before you even stand. That is one of the camp's crueler tricks. The work begins again before the old pain has packed up and left. Then you step outside into the breath of dawn and the cold lands on your cheeks like a warning. This, more than many imagined, is the actual rhythm of mining life. Not a thrilling moment of discovery every afternoon, not a jaunty little pan in a sparkling stream, but repetition. Hard repetition. Men in the California diggings and in later rushes often worked from first light until dusk, especially when weather and water conditions allowed. The image of the lone adventurer striking it rich survives because it is dramatic. The reality was usually long hours of monotonous labour broken by tiny flashes of possibility. You make your way toward the claim or the stretch of ground you hope might justify your aching spine. The earth underfoot is cold and uneven. Tools clink together in the dim light. Around you figures move with sleepy determination carrying picks, Shovels, pans, buckets, rocking cradles, or whatever contraption they have managed to build, borrow, or believe in. Nobody speaks much at first. Morning has not yet granted enough energy for conversation. The camp for this brief span is subdued, as if every person is privately renegotiating his relationship with pain. And then the labour starts. A pick bites earth with a dull thud. Shovels scrape gravel. Water sloshes into pans. The soundscape becomes rhythmic in a rough, unmusical way. Part percussion, part punishment. You bend, lift, scoop, carry, pour, swill, crouch and repeat. Over, ad, vim. Gravel into the pan. Water in. Tilt. Shake. Let the lighter material wash away. Watch for the heavier particles settling low. Try not to fool yourself. Try not to imagine gold where there is only mica flashing briefly like a liar's smile. Your hands learn first. They learn what the wooden handle feels like after an hour, then 3, then 10 days. They learn the sting of fresh blisters and the duller misery of hardened skin splitting anyway. They learn how mud gets under the nails and stays there as if filing a permanent dress change. The body becomes practical very quickly. Grace departs. Efficiency takes over. If you are lucky, you work near moving water because placer mining washing gold from loose sediment shaped much of early camp life. That much is firmly established. The glittering metal often settled in riverbeds and stream deposits, which meant men spent endless days kneeling, crouching or standing in cold water coaxing meaning from mud. It sounds poetic when summarized neatly. In practice, it leaves your lower back throbbing and your socks offended beyond repair. Some men work with pans alone, patient and solitary. Others use rocker boxes or long Tom's devices meant to process more dirt and gravel than a single pan could manage. Those are clever in a frontier sort of way, but they still demand labour. Everything here does. Even ingenuity requires hauling, fixing, balancing, and swearing. The camp admires invention only if it survives contact with wet soil and exhausted hands. You find too that time stretches strangely when the work is repetitive. 1 hour can feel like 3, then suddenly the light has shifted, and the whole morning is gone consumed by earth water, and the stubborn hope that the next pan will justify the last 50. There is a hypnotic quality to it. Swirl, wash, inspect. Swirl, wash, inspect. The motions begin to sink into your nerves. At moments it almost feels meditative if meditation involved freezing fingers and the constant possibility of financial ruin. There were all kinds of little camp beliefs about how to improve your odds. Some men swore by a particular angle of pan. Others muttered that certain bends in a stream held better promise because gold being heavy settled where water slowed. And in a wonderfully odd fringe detail, there are accounts from different mining regions of prospectors trusting lucky tools, hats, boots, or even specific spoons and bottles with a seriousness that would have impressed a medieval pilgrim. Once chance governed your supper, superstition slips in through the back flap of the tent almost unnoticed. By midday, the pleasant part of the morning, which admittedly was rather theoretical, has disappeared. The sun climbs. If it is hot, your neck burns and your shirt sticks between the shoulders. If it is cold, wet cloth stays clammy against the skin and the wind sneaks into every opening. Dust rises where the ground is dry. Mud grips where it is not. Flies take a personal interest in your face. The camp's natural world is very democratic in one respect. It inconveniences everyone. You pause to eat, if that is the word. More often it is a matter of chewing something while standing, sitting on a rock, or squatting beside your tools with the expression of a man briefly remembering civilization. Bread if you have it, beans if you are organised, salt pork if your teeth and patience are willing to cooperate, coffee if fortune has smiled more reliably on your provisions than on your pan. Then it is back to work, because stopping too long means losing light, and losing light means losing opportunity. And opportunity is the sacred thing here, more revered than comfort, reason or proper posture. By afternoon the body becomes noisier in its complaints. Shoulders tighten, wrists ache, knees resent every bend. The small muscles you never noticed in ordinary life now submit itemized objections. Even your eyes tire from the constant close attention from staring into shallow water and gritty sand looking for specks that may or may not alter your future. You begin to understand why some miners developed a particular stare, narrowed and searching, as if the world were always 1 inch away from revealing either reward or mockery. There is also the emotional labour which may be worse. The work invites obsession. A promising glint can electrify you. A barren pan can flatten you. A decent showing after hours of nothing can revive the whole day. Then the next 3 pans may produce almost nothing and send your hopes limping again. Mining is not merely exhausting because it is physical. It is exhausting because it keeps the mind bobbing between hunger and anticipation. Researchers remain divided on whether the mythology of independence around the miner was earned by genuine self-reliance or exaggerated by later storytelling that smoothed over how collaborative, improvised and socially dependent camp labour often was. Out where you stand, the answer appears mixed. Yes, you work with your own hands. Yes, your endurance matters. But tools are borrowed, water sources are shared information, travels by gossip, and success can hinge on what another man tells you about a gravel bar 2 bends upstream. Even loneliness here has company. As the light lowers, everyone starts moving a little differently. More slowly, more carefully. Men straighten with effort and hold a hand to the small of the back. Pans are examined one last time with ritual seriousness. Buckets are emptied. Tools are gathered. A man who found a few decent flakes tries to look casual and fails. Another who found almost nothing keeps his face blank, which is its own kind of announcement. The day's verdict is rarely dramatic. It comes in dustings, traces, tiny weights, quiet disappointments. And that is perhaps the hardest truth to absorb. The camp runs on stories of sudden fortune, but most workdays end not with triumph, only with a little more proof that you can keep going. You return from the creek or the diggings, damp, sore, streaked with grit, and carrying either a minute pinch of gold or none worth mentioning. The body hums with fatigue. Your palms are raw. Your boots feel heavier than in the morning. Smoke from the evening fires begins to drift again through camp, and it smells less welcoming now than inevitable. Yet you return tomorrow, of course you do, because once you have spent a full day bending over cold water and broken earth, once your muscles have accepted this new grammar of labour, once your hands have learned the handle and the pan and the slow, cruel patience of gravel, you begin to see the camp's deepest spell. It is not gold itself. It is the belief that endurance must eventually pay. After all this effort, surely the ground cannot keep saying no forever. By the 2nd or 3rd morning, perhaps sooner, if your stomach has a dramatic personality, you begin to understand that camp food is not just food. It is mood, stamina, memory class, hope, and on very bad days a form of light psychological warfare. Breakfast announces itself before you see it. Smoke curls low in the chilly air. Grease hisses in pans blackened by repeated service. Coffee, thin or strong depending on luck and purse, gives off a bitter smell so heavenly that men with absolutely no poetry left in them still pause for it. Somewhere beans are already warming. Somewhere salt pork is sputtering with that stubborn, fatty insistence that says this again yes, and likely tomorrow too. Tin cups knock it against boards, spoons scrape kettles. The camp eats noisily because it lives noisily. You line up squat by a fire or fumble with your own miserable cook setup, and what reaches your plate is rarely elegant. Beans, bread if it has survived to storage weather and mice. Bacon or salt pork, often more salt than pork if we are being honest, and history usually is not. Perhaps coffee thick enough to wake your ancestors, or perhaps a pale brown liquid with ambitious branding. The great glamour of the goldfields has in this moment narrowed into whether the beans are merely dull or actively punitive. This was one of the most ordinary truths of mining life. Diets in many camps were repetitive and heavily dependent on preserved staples because fresh produce, dairy, and varied ingredients were expensive, hard to transport, and quick to spoil. Flour beans, coffee salt meat, and dried goods formed the backbone of camp eating in numerous rushes. It kept people moving more or less, but it was not the kind of diet that inspired songs unless they were tragic and set to a fiddle. At first, you tell yourself that hunger makes anything taste good, and to a point that is true. After hours of digging, chewing stale bread beside a smoky fire can feel almost profound, but monotony has its own weight. After enough mornings with beans, enough nights with pork, enough coffee that tastes of tin and soot, the mouth itself begins to lose enthusiasm. You do not exactly stop eating. Your body would stage a revolt. But pleasure and eating drift apart. Meals become transactions with fatigue. You notice how much conversation orbits food. Men discuss the quality of flour as if debating politics. Someone boasts of finding onions from a wagon just in. Another speaks in reverent tones of a pie eaten weeks ago in a town farther downriver, as though describing a lost civilization. Someone else claims a cook tent nearby serves stew with actual visible vegetables, and the rumour spreads with the charged energy normally reserved for news of a promising claim. Hunger sharpens imagination. A boiled potato can become legend. And then there is the camp coffee, which deserves its own quiet memorial. It is everywhere. It is almost never delicate. It may be boiled too long, brewed with grounds that have already seen service, or poured from a pot that tastes faintly of yesterday's smoke and the day before's despair. Yet it matters enormously. It warms the hands. It cuts through morning fog in the mind. It gives structure to misery. A miner might endure a poor breakfast with stoicism but deny him coffee, and suddenly philosophy becomes difficult. In some camps and along some trails, cooks stretched meals in wonderfully desperate ways using whatever could bulk up a pot. Dried apples, scraps of biscuit beans cooked into near-paste tough meat, softened by endless boiling, even improvised gravies that were less recipe than negotiation. One particularly peculiar camp detail recorded in different frontier settings is how prizes condiments could become. A little pepper mustard vinegar or molasses could transform not the food itself, which remained fundamentally stubborn, but the morale surrounding it. Entire emotional recoveries have probably been founded on one spoonful of something sharp or sweet. You begin to recognize who eats well and who merely eats. Men with money or a recent lucky strike can buy better provisions, visit boarding houses, or pay for meals prepared by someone with actual skill. Others scrape by on staples and improvisation. Some share supplies with partners. Some go into debt for food, which is a bleak arrangement when your future income depends on stones and chance. Even around the fire class reassembles itself. The frontier is supposed to flatten society, but somehow good butter still finds a way to announce hierarchy. There is also the matter of nutrition, though. The camp would rarely phrase it so politely. Bodies doing punishing labour need variety, but camps often did not provide much of it. Fresh fruit and vegetables might arrive sporadically, and at absurd prices. Milk could be scarce. Eggs, when available, might be treasured like heirlooms. The result was not always immediate collapse, but a slow wearing down, gums sore, skin dull, energy, strange moods brittle. Not every miner could have explained vitamins, obviously, but plenty understood perfectly well that the body ran better on a more than beans and bravado. Specialists continue to differ on how much poor diet versus overwork explains the physical decline seen in many mining populations. Some place the heaviest emphasis on relentless labour exposure and disease. Others stress that monotonous limited food left miners less able to recover from all the rest. From where you sit with your tin plate cooling on your knees, the distinction feels theoretical. The body does not experience these hardships separately. It receives them as one long argument. Cooking for yourself when you try becomes another chapter in frontier humility. The fire smokes in your face. The pan tilts oddly because the ground is uneven. Bread burns on one side and remains pale on the other. bacon spits hot fat onto your fingers. Beans stick if you stop stirring. Water either takes forever to boil or suddenly lunges over the edge as if offended. And all of this happens while ash drifts where it pleases, and some nearby man, effortlessly annoying, appears to be producing an edible meal with criminal ease. Still, there are moments of odd comfort. The smell of bread browning even badly can stir a memory of kitchens far away. A shared pot around dusk makes strangers gentler for a few minutes. A miner who has had a better day might toss in extra coffee for the group. Someone produces dried peaches from a package saved for weeks. Another has sugar and becomes briefly powerful. Food in camp is rarely luxurious, but now and then it becomes communal, and that matters almost as much. There are also little rituals that develop because monotony itself invites ceremony. A careful stirring of the pot, a lucky tin cup always used for morning coffee, a piece of salt pork sliced with absurd precision to make it last. Men teasing one another about who cooks like a saint and who cooks like a saboteur. These habits are not trivial. They are ways of preserving personality in a place determined to sand everyone down into labouring shapes. By evening, the camp smells richer than in the morning, if richer is the word. Smoke thickens, meat sizzles, beans bubble, grease onions if you are fortunate enough to be near the mulm, wet wool damp boots drying by fire, and the sweet edge of molasses, or baking if someone has money, all mingle under the cooling sky. It can be comforting, almost home-like for half a breath until the wind shifts, and reminds you that one nearby cook has burned something into a regrettable state. Even so, supper draws people in. Tired men sit lower. Voices soften. A spoon in hot food feels like civilization trying not to embarrass itself, and yet the sameness keeps pressing in. Morning beans, evening beans. Pork bread coffee. A loop of salt grease starch and fatigue. The camp runs on repetition in every direction, and the diet is part of that machinery. You work the same motions, walk the same mud smell, the same smoke, and eat the same meal until the days blur around the edges. Gold is supposed to dazzle, but daily life here is mostly brown, grey, and bacon-coloured. That is what makes every variation so emotional. A fresh apple, a little jam, a potato not yet wrinkled into sadness. A pie at a cook shop if fortune has briefly mistaken you for someone richer. These things do more than fill the stomach. They remind you that the world once contained softness and choice, that meals could surprise you, that flavour could arrive without hardship dragging a chair up beside it. You scrape the last of supper from your plate, swallow, coffee gone lukewarm, and sit for a moment in the firelight while the camp settles into its nighttime muttering. Your body is tired in layers. Your hands smell of smoke and salt. The food has done its duty, though perhaps not gracefully. Around you other men eat with the same flat concentration, each one fueled for another dawn. The dream of gold remains in circulation, glittering somewhere out beyond the dark. But the camp, far more practically, is built on beans. By now you have stopped imagining privacy as a normal human condition and begun to think of it the way one thinks of peacocks or marble baths, charming things that clearly belong to some other branch of society. You wake with someone snoring 3 feet away, another man coughing into the dark, and a draft slipping under the canvas as if it pays rent. Your blanket smells faintly of smoke, damp wool, and your own exhausted body. The ground beneath you has acquired its own map of lumps and cold patches. If rain came in the night, some part of your bedding is wet. If no rain came, dust has still found you, because dust in a mining camp behaves less like weather and more like policy. That is the first intimate truth of camp life. Filth is not an occasional inconvenience. It is a constant companion. In many mining settlements, overcrowding and poor sanitation were routine features of daily existence, especially during rapid boom periods when thousands arrived faster than shelter or waste systems could be improvised. People slept in tents, brush shelters, rough plank cabins, shared bunks, wagons, or any corner not already occupied by another hopeful sufferer. Sanitation rarely kept pace, washing facilities were limited, refuse accumulated. Streams serve too many purposes at once and almost none of them improve the water. You feel this reality on your skin before you think it through. Your shirt rubs with a permanent hint of grit at the collar. Your socks, if they're still holding together, collect a dampness that never quite leaves. Mud dries on trouser hems in stiff ridges. Sweat salts the fabric. Smoke settles into everything. If you hang clothes by the fire, they come away warmer, but smelling as though they have personally fought a forest. If you try to keep them clean, the camp laughs in 17 different accents. Washing yourself becomes a project rather than a habit. There may be a creek nearby, but it is cold enough to make your bones reconsider their loyalty. There may be a basin, if you are lucky, though the water in it usually takes on a discouraging colour rather quickly. Soap exists certainly, but not always in sufficient quantities, and not always at a price that encourages generous use. So you compromise. A splash to the face, hands rinsed, neck rubbed down, perhaps the feet if you can summon both water and courage. It is not bathing in the civilized sense. It is more a treaty negotiated with grime. And then there are the insects. Lice, fleas, bedbugs and flies are the tiny supporting cast of camp misery, always present, never invited. They travel in bedding clothing, shared quarters, and the general warmth of crowded human life. A camp can spend its evenings discussing fortunes and claims while half its population is quietly scratching under the table. You discover very quickly that it is possible to be tired enough to sleep through discomfort which feels like a personal low even by frontier standards. One wonderfully strange and rather grim little detail from some camps is the amount of energy people put into airing blankets, baking clothing near fires, or boiling garments in desperate attempts to drive out pests. Imagine a grown man treating his trousers like a military campaign. Yet that is exactly the kind of practical drama camp life creates. Clothing is no longer fashion, it is shelter, skin and battleground. The sleeping arrangements do not help. If you share a tent or a cabin, the air inside by morning has the thick-used quality of too many lungs and not enough ventilation. Boots line the entrance in a row of mute accusations. Blankets overlap. Gear gets misplaced, borrowed, kicked or sat on. Someone rolls over and takes half the covering. Someone talks in sleep. Someone grinds his teeth. Someone rises before dawn and manages to make the maximum amount of noise with one tin cup and a very modest number of belongings. You would not have thought such clatter possible. Experience educates. Even the simple acts of changing clothes become strangely public. There are no elegant dressing screens here, no private room where you can unbutton dignity at leisure. You turn away, crouch in shadow, use a blanket as a barrier, or else surrender and become practical. Camp life strips embarrassment by inches. At first that feels shocking, later it feels efficient. The body becomes just another tool to manage prone to odour-wear, soreness and occasional rebellion. You also start noticing how the camp itself smells at different times of day. Morning carries wet earth, sour bedding, cold ashes and the first smoke of rekindled fires. Midday has dust, sweat, horse droppings, trampled grass and warm canvas. Night adds grease, damp wool tobacco, spilled drink, and the heavy, tired scent of many bodies winding down. It is an entire rotating calendar of human survival. Not romantic, perhaps, but specific, very specific. There is a long-running disagreement among historians about whether descriptions of camp filth were exaggerated by later observers eager to dramatize frontier life, or whether the reality was even worse than many respectable accounts admitted. The trouble is that respectable accounts often blush at detail. They say conditions were rough and move politely on. Your socks, however, would prefer more honest language. The evidence of the census suggests that many camps were indeed deeply unsanitary, especially in wet weather or during crowded seasons. You see the consequences in little ways first. Skin rashes, chafing, small cuts that stay dirty too long, boots that rub blisters raw because they never fully dry, men scratching at wrists or collars, bedding that feels permanently inhabited by unwelcome life forms. Then in larger ways, the whole environment begins to wear people down. Sleep comes, but not always well. Rest happens, but not always enough. And a body that cannot properly recover is easier prey for every other trouble waiting in camp. The lack of privacy works on the mind too. There is almost nowhere to be alone unless you deliberately walk away from camp. And even then, someone may already be there washing a pan, taking a smoke, or looking equally haunted by the need for a solitary minute. You begin to miss silence in odd flashes. Not grand silence, not mountain majesty, just the tiny household quiet of a room with a door. The luxury of hearing your own thoughts without someone nearby discussing gravel yields or boot repairs. Yet people adapt because people always do. They create habits, little boundaries within the crowd. One man keeps his kit arranged with almost religious precision. Another claims a certain rock by the creek for washing. Someone develops an exact routine for airing blankets at noon. Someone else becomes known for sweeping the cabin floor, which is both admirable and slightly futile, like trying to discipline weather. These routines matter. They preserve a sliver of order inside the shared disorder. Women in camp, when present in domestic or business spaces, often became central to whatever cleanliness could be managed, though it is important not to flatten that into some sentimental frontier myth. Washing, cooking, mending, and running orderly spaces were labour, not magic, and they were often among the most valued services in camp life. Laundry in particular could command remarkable prices. A clean shirt was not just a clean shirt. It was relief status, and occasionally the only thing standing between a man and complete moral collapse. You can feel that value yourself when some rare act of tidying succeeds. A washed face, dry socks, a blanket shaken free of dust, a shirt not quite clean, but at least less accusatory. These moments do not solve the camp. They simply make it survivable for another day. And survivable is the real frontier luxury, much more common than prosperity, and far more useful. By evening you sit outside your shelter watching smoke drift upward, while the camp mutters through supper and small disputes. Your hands are cleaner than at dawn, though not clean enough to impress anyone fastidious. Your boots are drying by the fire in a way that suggests future stiffness. Inside the tent your bedding waits with deeply mixed intentions. Somewhere nearby someone is already scratching. Somewhere else somebody is heating water with the triumphant air of a person who has secured civilization in a bucket. You breathe in smoke, wool, mud and dusk, and you realise that in a mining camp gold is only part of what men search for. Sometimes what they really want is one dry blanket, one quiet corner, and one night without anything biting them. When darkness settles over the camp, you might imagine things finally becoming restful, a little quieter, perhaps even reflective. That would be adorable. Night does not calm our mining camp so much as change its costume. The day's labour loosens its grip, picks and pans go still, and into that space rushes another economy entirely. One built from noise-longing, bravado, and the desperate human need to feel alive after spending 12 hours bent over cold earth. Fires brighten. Lanterns glow through canvas. Laughter rises too loudly and too quickly. Somewhere a fiddle starts up with the kind of scratchy enthusiasm that suggests talent is less important than volume. Men wash off what dirt they can slick back hair with water that has seen better uses and go looking for relief. You follow the current because nearly everyone does. The camp at night smells different from the camp by morning. Smoke still hangs in the air, of course, because smoke is practically a resident, but now it mixes with whiskey lamp oil, grease from late suppers, damp wool steaming near fires, and the sweet stale scent of crowded canvas rooms holding too many people and too much hope. The pathways between tents and shacks shine with mud where lantern light catches them. Boots squelch, voices overlap, a burst of song tumbles out of one doorway. A curse flies from another. The whole place shivers with a nervous kind of merriment. This is one of the plainest truths of Gold Camp life. Entertainment was not a side note. In many mining settlements, gambling halls, saloons, dance houses, music rooms, and makeshift theatres became central institutions almost as soon as basic trade was established. Men who had endured grinding work, isolation, and uncertainty looked for company, distraction, and the brief illusion of control. A card table could provide all three at least until it took your money. You duck into a gambling tent or a rough plank room that calls itself a saloon with the confidence of a much finer establishment. Inside the light is dim and golden. It catches on tin cups, glass bottles, sweat on foreheads, and cards flicked across worn tables by practiced hands. The room hums, not loudly at first, more like a nest of wasps thinking things over. Then a cheer breaks loose. A groan follows. Coins clatter. Someone laughs too hard at a joke that was only mildly funny, which is often the first sign he has already been drinking. There is a physical pleasure in simply being warm upright and among people who are not presently digging. That alone explains part of the appeal, but the deeper attraction is emotional. All day the earth decides what you receive. At night, the cards pretend to negotiate. Dice suggest fairness even when none exists. A glass offers temporary amnesty from aching hands and persistent thoughts. Music gives the body permission to remember that it can move for reasons other than labour. And yet the camp's nightlife is never only cheerful. Loneliness sits in every room like an uninvited uncle. You see it in the man who keeps buying drinks for conversation he cannot sustain. You hear it in the sudden silence after a song ends. You feel it when laughter tipped just briefly into something frantic. Many miners lived far from home, surrounded by strangers tethered to uncertain futures. So the saloon or gaming table was not merely vice, it was medicine theatre, church and trap. One curious little feature of some camps is the sheer variety of entertainment people improvise from almost nothing. Alongside cards and drink there could be comic recitations, fiddle tunes, dancing bears in a few places, amateur plays, boxing matches, puppet shows and lecturers promising wisdom to men who mostly wanted a chair and a drink. Human beings will stage diversion anywhere, even in a muddy settlement where the floor tilts and the audience smells like creek water. Especially there, perhaps. You notice how different men behave after dark. The stern bent labourer from the creek may become a sentimental singer after 2 cups. The quiet one at supper turns reckless at cards. The boaster gets louder naturally because some natural laws cannot be suspended. A lucky miner who pulled a decent amount of gold that day may suddenly become the evening's bright centre, buying rounds, accepting admiration, and radiating the dangerous confidence of someone temporarily mistaken for destiny's favourite. The camp loves a winner for exactly as long as the winner keeps spending. Drink flows through all of this like a second river. In mining settlements across the 19th century, alcohol was ubiquitous and often costly. Yet men paid for it anyway because it offered warmth, numbness, ritual, and release. You can see why. After a day of physical punishment, a swallow of whiskey burns cleanly down and seems to draw a line between work and not work. A second swallow makes the line blur. A third may inspire philosophy or singing. A fourth starts writing letters your future self will not admire. Still, the pleasure is real. You cannot deny it. A song catches the room. Boots stamp in time. Someone tells a story about a near strike, a bad mule, a river crossing, or a card game in another camp. And even if half of it is invented, invention has its uses. For a little while, the men around you are not merely labouring bodies in a harsh economy. They are companions, rivals, listeners, fools, comedians, homesick sons, boastful husbands, and walking bundles of memory. Night returns complexity to people, daylight flattens into workers. Not everyone approves, of course. Contemporary observers and later commentators often disagreed over whether camp nightlife was mostly a symptom of moral collapse or a predictable social release in extreme conditions. Some emphasise drinking, gambling and prostitution as evidence of vice overwhelming restraint. Others argued that these activities reflected ordinary human coping under pressure amplified by isolation and skewed demographics. Both readings contain truth. Camp nights could be rowdy, exploitative, reckless, and also deeply human. Desperation and delight are not enemies. In these places they share tables. You drift from one fire to another, one doorway to the next, and the camp keeps offering scenes. A cook tent where men nurse cups and talk softly. A gambling room thick with tobacco and concentration. A dance hall with rough boards underfoot where music scrapes through the air and tired people move with surprising grace. A quiet patch just beyond the last lantern where someone sits alone writing by a flickering light, or perhaps only pretending to write because the gesture feels close to home. There is no single camp night. There are 100 versions unfolding at once, and there is risk in nearly all of them. Money disappears fast after dark. Fights begin over cards, over insults, over someone looking too long at someone else's gold dust pouch, over the oldest frontier cause of all, which is tired men deciding they are not tired. A lucky evening at the table can vanish in half an hour. A lonely man can wake having spent the week's stake on drink, boasting and very poor judgment. Camp nights are full of small cliffs that do not look like cliffs until morning. That is why the atmosphere feels so charged. Every pleasure carries a shadow. Music may lead to laughter, but also to homesickness. Drink may soften the body, but loosen the tongue. Gambling may offer hope, but sharpen envy. Company may ease loneliness, but remind you more clearly of the people not here. Under the lantern glow, the camp becomes almost tender for a moment, then immediately rough again like a hand that does not know its own strength. By late evening, the sounds thin and thicken at once. Some voices fade to murmurs around banked fires. Other rooms grow louder, their occupants not yet persuaded by reason, exhaustion, or the hour. The fiddle slows. The cards keep moving. Outside, the night air cools your face and carries the smell of wet earth from the edge of camp. Above you, the stars look indecently calm, as if they have never watched a man lose his blanket money over a crooked deck. You stand there for a breath, listening. Behind you, the camp searches for relief with music, drink, and noise. Ahead of you waits another dawn, another pan, another day of labour. And somewhere in between those two worlds, you begin to understand the deeper danger of camp nights. It is not just that they can ruin a man. It is that for a few warm hours, they can make him forget how ruined he already feels. You notice her before the camp quite knows what to do with itself. Not because she's dressed like some polished frontier heroine from a sentimental painting, because camp life ruins that kind of neat fantasy almost on sight. Not because she glides through the mud untouched either. Nobody glides here. The mud is far too democratic. You notice her because the whole settlement subtly rearranges its attention. Men stop mid-sentence. A man carrying a sack pretends not to stare and fails with genuine commitment. Someone straightens his hat as if the gesture might restore civilization to the continent. The camp, so loud and grimy and stubbornly male in its habits, becomes newly self-conscious for half a moment, and then naturally it overdoes everything. Mining camps were overwhelmingly male in many gold rush regions, especially in the early surge periods. But women were never absent from these places. They arrived as wives, widows, cooks, laundry workers, boarding house keepers, sex workers, merchants, entertainers and entrepreneurs, and their presence often altered the social and economic life of a camp, far more than nostalgic frontier stories later admitted. Men like to describe themselves as the centre of the drama. In practice, women frequently ran the parts that kept camp life from dissolving into complete farce. You begin by noticing the practical authority some women hold. A boarding house mistress can command more real obedience than a dozen swaggering miners because she controls meals beds, and perhaps the only tolerably clean room for half a mile. A laundress with a good reputation acquires near sacred standing among men who have forgotten the original colour of their shirts. A woman selling pies, coffee, mended gloves, candles, or hot food becomes the axis around which exhausted bodies and small coins turn. The camp may prattle endlessly about gold, but daily life keeps kneeling before whoever can provide warmth, washing and something edible after sunset. The atmosphere around these businesses feels different from the gambling tents and supply counters. Not gentler exactly, because labour here is labour everywhere, but more structured. There are prices, expectations, routines. You stand in line for a plate or a washed shirt and feel for a flicker of time that the world still contains systems more advanced than shouting. The smell helps. Bread, stew, soap, starch, coffee, a trace of lavender perhaps if somebody has saved a bit from home, or just the clean mineral scent of boiled linen drying. Compared with the surrounding perfume of mud smoke, whiskey, bacon grease and male overconfidence, it is practically royal. But camp life does not become suddenly wholesome because women are present. That would be a very lazy striae, and frontier life despises laziness except in very rich men. Women in mining camps often lived under intense scrutiny, high expectations and regular danger. The gender imbalance meant female presence could be both economically advantageous and socially exhausting. A woman might be treated as a novelty, a temptation, a civilizing influence, a target, a business rival, or all five before breakfast. Respect could be genuine, but it was rarely simple. You see this in the eyes around you. Some men become absurdly gallant, rediscovering manners last exercised near actual parlours. Others grow foolish, boastful, or proprietary, with no legal or moral basis whatsoever. Still others look away out of awkwardness as though womanhood itself were a delicate imported object that might crack if directly observed. The camp performs masculinity rather badly under ordinary conditions. Add women and the performance becomes almost theatrical. There were also women who entered camp economies in ways respectable chroniclers once tried very hard to tidy up or leave vague. Dance houses, saloons and brothels became part of many boom towns, and the women working in or around those spaces lived in a hard mix of opportunity, exploitation, visibility and risk. Some earned impressive sums compared with ordinary female wages elsewhere. Some gained a degree of independence that would have been difficult back east or in Europe. Many also faced judgment, insecurity, illness, harassment and violence. Frontier mythology likes neat categories. Real lives rarely oblige. One odd and revealing little camp detail is how prized certain female-coded skills or items became when men were left to their own domestic ruin for too long. A neatly mended shirt, a proper pie crust, a haircut done with care, curtains in a boarding room, flowers in a tin, even a well-set table could acquire an almost enchanted status. Men who had spent months living in smoke and disorder responded to these signs of order like pilgrims seeing relics. Not because cloth napkins possessed supernatural powers, though. On some evenings the argument could be made, but because domestic skill reminded them that life did not have to be permanently improvised. You also begin to notice the women who move through camp without fitting anyone's preferred script. The widow running a store with severe efficiency. The cook who takes no nonsense and has no time for sentimental nonsense about frontier angels. The wife keeping accounts while her husband performs ruggedness in public. The daughter carrying water, taking payments and learning quickly which men are safe, which are merely loud, and which require distance. These are not side characters in the camp story. They are among the people making the camp function at all. Researchers differ on how much women softened camp society versus simply becoming adept at surviving within an already brutal environment. Some interpretations present female presence as the beginning of order, family life and respectability. Others argue this romanticizes the burden placed on women and understates how much they themselves had to navigate insecurity, prejudice and exhausting labour. You can see the problem at once. Yes, some women introduced routines, businesses and social norms that altered the camp, but they were not decorative moral upgrades installed for male benefit. They were workers, survivors, and often astute economic actors in their own right. There is another layer too, one the camp often understands only dimly. Women are not all living the same experience here. Class matters. Marital status matters, race matters, ethnicity matters. A white boarding house owner, a Chinese woman navigating exclusion and suspicion, a Mexican laundress, an indigenous woman trading goods or moving through a camp built on recently disrupted land, a woman in a dance hall, a miner's wife cooking for 6 boarders and 1 infant. These are all frontier women, yet not remotely in the same way. The camp collapses people into categories because camps are lazy thinkers. Life resists. And still, in the middle of all this strain, there are small human scenes that settle into memory. A woman standing in a doorway, shaking flour from her apron, while arguing prices with perfect confidence. Someone reading a letter aloud beside a lamp, while a child falls asleep against a rolled blanket. A wash line of shirts moving gently in late light, each one startlingly clean. A little row of miracles. A laugh from inside a tent that sounds less forced than most. A hand resting briefly on another hand over a table crowded with mugs and crumbs. These moments do not cancel the hardship, they interrupt it. You become aware too of how much the camp projects its own anxieties onto women. Men talk of women bringing refinement, temptation, trouble, stability, expense, hope, scandal and home, often in the same breath. What they really reveal is themselves. The camp is unstable, lonely, performative, and often hungry for symbols to organise its confusion. Women get pressed into those symbolic roles constantly, even while doing the very unsymbolic tasks of boiling laundry, balancing ledgers, carrying slop buckets, setting prices and keeping people fed. By evening the air cools and the camp glows in pockets of yellow light. You pass a boarding tent where spoons knock softly against bowls and conversation stays low. Farther off, the louder establishments keep up their fiddles and boasting. Smoke drifts over everything in loose blue ribbons. A woman closes a door flap against the night, and for a moment the act seems more profound than it should, a tiny claim to order in a world built on chance. That is when it fully settles over you. This place may look like a man's world from a distance, all shovels and noise and rough boots in mud. But up close, as with most dramatic frontiers, the reality is less flattering and more interesting. The men dig and gamble and dream loudly. The women very often are the ones finding ways to make life here continue at all, and continuity in a mining camp is a rarer treasure than gold dust. You learn very quickly that order in a mining camp is less a sturdy building than a chair balanced on one uneven leg. At first glance, this seems liberating. No distant official peering over your shoulder, no polished courthouse, no rows of clerks with tidy cuffs and a talent for saying no. Just free men in a raw place making their own way. That is how some people like to describe the goldfields, with a glow of admiration and just enough exaggeration to make the mud sound noble. But after a few days, perhaps a week, you start to notice what freedom looks like when it has not yet hired enough structure. It looks noisy, it looks improvised, it looks like 6 men arguing over a boundary line, while 12 others gather close because they would very much like a break from their own troubles. Many mining camps formed faster than formal government could reach them. So local customs, minor meetings and makeshift courts often shaped everyday justice in the early stages. That is one of the clearest features of camp life. Rules existed certainly, but they were often drafted on the spot, adjusted under pressure, and enforced by whoever had enough support nerve or volume. A law book might be admired in theory. A loud crowd with shovels had much more immediate relevance. You first see this at a claim meeting or what passes for one. Men gather in a rough open patch between shelters and tool piles. The air smells of dirt, smoke and damp cloth. Boots grind into the ground, hats are pushed back, voices overlap. Somebody speaks with solemn importance. Somebody else interrupts before solemnity gets ideas above its station. A man with a scrap of paper may try to record proceedings, though whether his handwriting or his authority is more fragile remains an open question. The topic might be claim size, water rights, trespass, theft work requirements, or the eternal frontier issue of who thought something was obvious. and who now insists it was never agreed at all. Everyone talks as though fairness is the object. Fairness, however, must squeeze its way through pride, suspicion, exhaustion, greed, and the fact that half the men present would rather be working than attending a public argument. Still, these meetings matter. They give shape to camp life. Without them, every disagreement would slide faster toward fists, knives, or lingering vendettas conducted through shovel placement. And yet even in these ragged gatherings, you can feel a strange seriousness. Men want rules not because they have become philosophers overnight, but because uncertainty is expensive. If no one knows how large a claim can be, how long it can lie idle, or what counts as trespass, then every patch of ground becomes an invitation to conflict. So the camp invents procedure. It may not be elegant, it may not even be especially consistent, but it is procedure enough to let tomorrow happen. There is often a local judge of sorts, though. Judge can mean anything from a respected elder miner to the loudest man currently wearing a coat with aspirations. Some camps held elections for officers or committees. Others recognized certain influential figures by habit rather than formal vote. Titles appear quickly in human societies, almost as quickly as opportunities to ignore them. A man may call himself Recorder Justice President of the Miners or Chairman of the District, and for an afternoon the title sticks. Whether it still sticks next week depends on results memory, and whether he has offended the wrong cluster of listeners. One oddly charming but revealing detail from some mining communities is how seriously people could treat handwritten notices nailed to posts, doors, or trees. A crooked sheet of paper flapping in the wind could announce boundaries, meetings, punishments, auctions, warnings, or regulations with all the pomp of a royal decree. There is something almost comic about such fragile documents carrying such heavy local importance. Yet that is the frontier in miniature. Institutions begin as scraps with confidence. You begin to notice that justice here has a theatrical side. A hearing is not only about the facts, it is about performance. Who appears calm, who sounds honest, who has friends standing behind him, who can describe a muddy event clearly enough to make the crowd nod. In more established places, power hides behind walls and stamps. Here it stands in the open with dirty boots and an audience. This can be refreshing in a rough way. It can also be alarming. Popular feeling is swift and not always wise. Some writers once praised camp law as proof that ordinary citizens could govern themselves beautifully when left alone. Others have looked at the same evidence and seen something much less ideal, a patchwork of exclusion, intimidation, racial prejudice, and quick judgments disguised as community wisdom. The truth, as usual, is untidier. These camp systems could be practical and adaptive. They could also be deeply unfair, especially to outsiders. Non-white miners, immigrants, indigenous people, and anyone lacking allies. Self-government sounds noble until you ask who gets counted as self. You see this in little frictions long before you witness any grand spectacle. A man with a familiar accent gets heard more patiently than a man whose speech marks him as foreign. A dispute involving an established miner receives more attention than one involving a newcomer with no companions to back his story. A camp may speak proudly of common rights while quietly reserving its sympathy for the common people it already recognizes. Justice, like coffee and shelter, is rarely distributed without social flavoring. Still, camp order is not pure fiction. Theft is punished. Violence may bring retaliation or expulsion. Claim jumping can trigger hearings and penalties. Disputes over water may be negotiated before they become ruinous. Men who never plan to serve on any civic body in their lives find themselves debating procedure beside a ditch. There is something almost touching in the effort, if you can ignore the occasional menace. Civilization keeps trying to sprout in the mud even when the mud appears skeptical. There is an active academic disagreement over whether minor codes deserve admiration as democratic grassroots systems or scrutiny as unstable arrangements shaped by convenience and power. Some emphasize participatory rulemaking and local adaptation. Others point out how quickly these systems reflected existing hierarchies and hardened prejudices. Standing among the crowd, you do not need a monograph to sense both. The men really are making rules together. They're also bending those rules around status, fear, urgency, and self-interest with extraordinary agility. And then there is punishment. Not every camp resorts to dramatic measures, but many possess a taste for public consequence. Fines, confiscation, expulsion, shaming, and occasionally rough physical treatment all appear in the record. The crowd likes visible closure. It wants to feel that order has been restored before supper. A man judged guilty may be marched out, watched closely, or stripped of some right he values. The details vary. The atmosphere does not. It is collective, intense, and faintly unstable, like weather gathering itself over dry ground. What startles you is how ordinary this all becomes. At home, law may have seemed distant, sealed inside official rooms. Here it is woven straight into daily camp life. It happens beside cook fires, near sluices under trees, in tents, along paths where boots track yesterday's mud through today's principles. A rule is proposed, a complaint is aired, a hearing is held, a verdict emerges, then everyone goes back to beans digging and sleep as if nothing remarkable has happened. Order is not a monument here. It is a continuous, messy chore. By dusk, the meeting breaks apart. Men drift away, still arguing in pairs. Someone claims justice was served. Someone else insists it was a circus. The notice goes up on a post for all to read or pretend to read with conviction. Smoke rises across camp. A dog noses at scraps near a plank walkway. Somewhere a card game has already started. Life resumes because it must, and that may be the most revealing thing of all. The camp does not wait for perfect government before continuing. It cannot afford perfection. It makes do with loud consensus, shaky records, public memory, and the constant threat of embarrassment. This would terrify a proper magistrate. Here it counts as progress. So you walk back through the cooling evening with the taste of dust still in your mouth and the sound of those arguing voices lingering in your ears. The goldfields promise freedom, yes. They also demand that people manufacture order out of impatience, noise, and half-trusted men with muddy boots. Sometimes it works just well enough to keep the camp standing, which in a place like this passes for a legal miracle. By this point you understand that gold is not the only thing buried in a mining camp. Resentment goes down deep too. It begins with a line in the dirt which sounds harmless enough. A mark, a stake, a scraped edge, where one man says his claim ends and another says his begins. Out in the open air under a sky that seems far too grand to care about such little boundaries, grown adults become passionately attached to measurements that would have bored them senseless back home. But here a few feet of riverbank or a narrow strip of gravel can hold a week's hope, a month's food, perhaps the difference between staying and slinking away. So the dirt matters, the inches matter, the line matters. Claimed disputes were among the most common sources of conflict in many gold rush settlements, where valuable deposits were uncertain, poorly surveyed, and often governed by local custom rather than formal title arguments over ownership were inevitable. That practical truth sits under camp life like a live coal. Everyone knows it is there. Everyone tries not to step on it. Plenty of people do anyway. You see how it happens. A man leaves his ground for a day or part of a day to fetch supplies, men, tools, recover from fever, or simply because his body refuses another hour of stooping. He returns to find someone else working near the edge, or perhaps right in the middle, wearing the innocent expression of a person who has rehearsed innocence carefully. Then comes the exchange, at first low, then louder, then sharp enough to pull heads around from 50 paces away. Nobody in camp is too busy to notice a boundary argument. It is one of the few entertainments with genuine stakes. The atmosphere changes almost instantly. Men drift closer with that pretended casualness unique to public conflict. One keeps chewing, another folds his arms. Somebody asks what the trouble is despite already knowing perfectly well. Boots shuffle over dust or mud. The air feels charged as though the ground itself is listening in. And the strange thing is that both men may sound convincing. One points to a marker, a bent branch at a stone pile, a notch on a post some earlier agreement witnessed by others who are now inconveniently absent or suddenly vague. The other insists the line was never there or was farther over, or that the claim had been abandoned, or that proper work had not been done to maintain it. In camps without precise surveying, memory becomes a legal instrument, and memory is one of the least obedient tools ever issued to mankind. It bends toward advantage with terrifying ease. You start learning the language of accusation, claim jumping, trespass, encroachment, idle holding, cheating the boundary, salting the dirt. A phrase whispered in camp can do almost as much damage as a broken shovel. Once a man gains a reputation for cheating, claims every move he makes gets watched, and not kindly. Trust in these places is thin to begin with. One boundary dispute can wear it down to paper. There were also the tiny acts of manipulation that never quite rose to the level of dramatic courtroom storytelling, but poisoned daily life just the same. A marker shifted in the night. A trench widened a touch too far. Gravel piled where it obscures the old edge. A man accidentally forgetting what he heard at last week's meeting. Another producing a witness whose certainty improves in direct proportion to friendship. Petty. Absolutely. Important entirely. Frontier life has a way of turning small dishonesties into structural events. One especially odd and telling tidbit from mining history is how much faith people could place in makeshift markers that weather animals or one clumsy boot could disturb. A claim boundary might be indicated by pegs, rock cairns, bits of cloth, blazed trees or rough ditches, all of them looking terribly official right up until a storm mule or opportunist intervened. Human beings, it seems, can build fierce emotional worlds around extremely fragile objects. Some disagreements stay verbal, others do not. You hear about shoving matches tools brandished for emphasis and long simmering feuds that infect every later interaction. Two men who quarrel over a claim today may sit across from one another at supper, in brittle silence glare at one another over cards by lantern light and recruit allies by morning. Conflict in camp does not stay neatly in its lane. It leaks, it turns social, it acquires cousins. That is what makes these disputes so corrosive. They are never just about dirt. They're about standing, pride, fairness, scarcity, the fear of being made a fool. A man can lose money and still recover his dignity if luck later improves. Lose face in public, be thought a cheat or a weakling, and the damage spreads in subtler ways. People stop partnering with you. They hesitate to lend tools. They do not repeat promising rumours in your hearing. Camp life is built on unstable cooperation, and grievance is a very effective solvent. Some historians suggest that minor disputes reveal a rough but functioning property culture emerging almost organically from shared need. Others see in the same conflicts a harsher lesson, that the camps were never as cooperative as nostalgic accounts claim, and that competition often sat much closer to the surface than miners like to admit. You do not need to take sides too quickly. Spend a week in camp and you can watch both versions walking around in boots. Men help one another with hauling and still squabble viciously over 3 feet of stream bank. Solidarity and selfishness are tentmates here. You also notice how camp memory works. People remember old disputes with unnerving precision when it suits them. That's the fellow who moved his marker in the rain. That one took gravel from his neighbour's wash pile. Those two have hated each other since the cedar stump business. The cedar stump business, whatever it was, now lives as permanent folklore. Gold camps produce these little legends constantly. Private histories of insult and suspicion that bind communities together as effectively as shared triumph. And then there is the possibility of deliberate fraud. Salting a claim by scattering gold where it was not naturally found. Exaggerating a strike to lure buyers. Selling an interest in poor ground with theatrical confidence. Such behaviour did occur enough to leave a lasting stain in camp lore. A place ruled by hope is vulnerable to performance, and mining camps are full of men willing to perform prosperity a little ahead of schedule. The buyer sees promise, the seller sees an exit. You begin to appreciate why so many miners developed a close, almost obsessive attention to routine. They inspect their ground, they note where markers stand, they keep track of who passes near. They talk to neighbours not merely from friendliness but from necessity. Watchfulness becomes part of the labour. You do not simply dig, you defend the right to dig where you believe you should. That secondary burden is tiring in its own special way. The body aches from work, the mind aches from vigilance. There is also a lively debate among researchers over whether claim conflicts became less frequent as camps matured and formal law arrived, or whether they simply changed form, growing more bureaucratic while remaining just as bitter. Either way, the underlying pressure never disappears. Scarcity remains scarcity even when written down more neatly. A contested patch of earth still has the power to ruin you. By late afternoon, after one of these quarrels has rippled through camp, the mood feels altered. Men return to work, yes, but with sidelong glances and renewed attention to boundaries. Conversations sharpen around the edges. Even the scraping of shovels sounds slightly more possessive. Territory has been made visible again. The illusion that everyone is simply pursuing fortune under the same bright sky has cracked, and under the crack lies the older truth. There is not enough easy wealth for everyone, so you walk back from the diggings carrying your tools and your fatigue, listening to the mutter of camp life as supper smoke begins to rise. Somewhere behind you, two men are still contesting a line in the dirt as if the fate of nations depends on it. In a way for them it does. A claim is food status tomorrow and a proof that your misery has a point. No wonder the arguments linger. In a gold, camp grudges are often the most durable thing anyone owns. Then the weather decides it would like a turn. Up to now, you may have been blaming the camp, the prices, the food, the noise, the men, the mud, the cards, the insects, and possibly the inventor of the shovel. All fair. But the sky over a mining camp has a way of reminding you that human misery is only one department in a much larger enterprise. The weather does not merely frame life here. It enters the tent, soaks the blanket, cracks the lips, floods the trench, bakes the neck, freezes the fingers, and rearranges the day with no concern for your plans. Morning can begin with a pale, harmless light and end in a downpour so thorough it seems personal, or dawn may arrive brittle and blue, the cold tight enough to sting your teeth only for noon to press down hot and glaring, turning your shirt into a damp second skin. In the goldfields, especially in exposed country and mountain regions, people lived at the mercy of swift shifts in temperature, rain, runoff, flood, drought, dust, and seasonal extremes. That much is well established. The old fantasy of the cheerful prospector in eternal sunshine survives because it fits nicely on a poster. The body knows best. You feel weather first through texture, wet canvas sagging, a boot sole gone soft at the edges, the rasp of dust between your teeth, the awful chill of cold water slashed into sleeves before the sun is properly up. Then through sound, rain drumming on the tent cloth, wind worrying the flap ties, creek water running faster than it did yesterday, trees creaking above camp, far-off thunder that makes every miner glance upward with a look halfway between prayer and irritation. Rain is one of the great destroyers of camp dignity. It turns paths into trenches, slopes into slides, and every honest step into an argument. Mud clutches at boots as if trying to keep souvenirs. Wagon wheels sink, pack animals lose patience. Blankets absorb dampness with supernatural enthusiasm. Fires sulk smoke excessively or die at the very moment you need them most. You can stand there holding a stubborn pot over a reluctant flame while rain taps on your hat and think with complete sincerity that civilization may have been a very good idea after all. And yet rain is not always the villain. For placer miners, water is life and method. Too little and washing gravel becomes difficult or impossible. Too much and streams swell, banks collapse, sluices fail, and whole working areas vanish under churning water. That is one of the great frontier ironies. The same element that lets you seek gold can also sweep away your access to it in an afternoon. Camps watched streams, almost like moods trying to read tomorrow from the surface of moving water. Then there is heat, which arrives differently but no less cruelly. Under a hard sun, tools become hot to the touch. Dust rises from trampled ground and the back of your neck feels as though the day is trying to brand you. Sweat runs into your eyes, carrying grit with it. Shirts cling, hats become sacred objects. Water, once merely practical, becomes a subject of urgent emotional interest. The camp slows not from laziness, but from the simple fact that bodies are not engines, however often frontier mythology tries to bully them into acting like it. Some miners learned to improvise shade wherever they could, rigging bits of canvas, brush or board near work areas. Others wrapped scarves or broad hats, or laboured in ways that sound faintly sensible now, and were treated then as personal eccentricities. One odd little detail from several mining regions is the use of makeshift cooling tricks that border on ritual. Wet cloth around the neck, hats lined or dampened, sleeping outside the shelter whenever possible, and unless bugs, rain theft, or general bad judgment made that too ambitious. In places of extreme inconvenience, simple comfort can take on the grandeur of strategy. Cold, meanwhile, has a quieter wickedness. It does not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it just slips into the edges of everything. Your fingers stiffen around the pan. Your breath hangs in front of you. Damp socks become a philosophical problem. Water bites the skin. Metal tools sting when first gripped. Men stamp their feet and hold cups longer than necessary, as though warmth can be negotiated through stubbornness. In higher altitude or early season camps, freezing temperatures and snow could halt work, isolate settlements, and make every ordinary task heavier. A number of rushes, not just California's, were shaped by this kind of climate pressure. Seasonal weather affected when claims could be worked, how supplies moved, and whether camps thrived, emptied, or turned briefly desperate. That is not a romantic side note. It is one of the structural facts of mining life. The weather did not simply inconvenience miners, it governed the pace and shape of the entire enterprise. And weather works on the mind as efficiently as on the body. A long wet spell can sour tempers and flatten morale. Heat makes everyone shorter spoken. Wind at night, flapping canvas and slipping smoke back into your face can leave you feeling personally harassed by the atmosphere. A clear day after bad weather lifts camp spirits with almost suspicious ease, as if people are embarrassed to discover how much the sky has been controlling them. There is an ongoing discussion among specialists about how much environmental hardship determined success in these camps compared with luck labour and access to capital. Some interpretations emphasize personal endurance and adaptation. Others stress that weather and terrain set harsh limits no amount of grit could overcome. Standing in wet boots while the creek runs too high and your fire refuses to catch you may feel this is not an especially difficult intellectual question. The elements do not care how motivated you are. Dust storms, or even just prolonged dryness, produce a different kind of exhaustion. Everything becomes coated. Hair sleeves, blankets, tin plates, flour sacks, tools, lips, thoughts. The camp looks faded as if rubbed with ash. Every footstep lifts powder. Coughing grows more constant. Water barrels become objects of scrutiny. Tempers grow brittle. Men talk more often about weather than about gold, which is perhaps the surest sign that weather is winning. Floods, however, are the camp's most theatrical warning. A creek that seemed cooperative yesterday can rise with shocking speed after heavy rain or upstream snowmelt. Banks slump, diggings disappear, gear is moved in a rush, men shout, animals are hauled back, the ground itself seems to loosen its grip on order. People who had looked merely tired at breakfast now look genuinely frightened, because rushing water has a way of making all human arrangements seem temporary and slightly silly, and for some camps that was the entire story in miniature. Temporary and slightly silly perched between ambition and runoff. Still, the camp adapts because it must. Trenches are dug, fires are sheltered, extra canvas is tied down, work shifts with the season and the day. Men learn which clouds matter. They store dry wood like misers. They keep one eye on the slope, another on the creek, and a third imaginary eye on tomorrow's sky. You do not conquer weather here. You become attentive to it in the way sailors and farmers do, with respect, irritation, and the occasional muttered insult. By evening, the day's weather leaves its signature on camp. Mud shining in ruts if it rained. Dust settled in every fold of cloth if it did not. Damp smoke lingering low. Cold already sliding down from the hills. Men dry socks wring, sleeves slap hats against their knees, compare stream levels, discuss frost glare at clouds and rework tomorrow's plans around conditions none of them can command. The gold remains underfoot, mysterious and stubborn, but the terms of access have been rewritten yet again by sky and season. So you sit by the fire or under the flap or on a crate outside, feeling the day still in your bones, and understand something the camp teaches without mercy. Nature is not the backdrop to this life. It is management. It decides whether the road holds, whether the creek behaves, whether your blanket dries, whether your fingers obey, whether hope feels practical or absurd. And some days it is the cruelest boss in the whole camp. Sooner or later, the camp stops pretending that toughness is enough. Until then, everyone speaks as if the body were a mule with opinions but no real authority. You wake sore, work sore, eat sore, sleep badly and begin again. A cut is wrapped. A cough is ignored. A strained back is called unfortunate and then asked to lift another bucket. This performance can continue for quite a while, especially in a place where nearly every man is afraid that pausing for too long will hand his chance to someone else. But mining camps have a ruthless way of revealing the limits of bravado. One slip, one fever, one infected blister, one bad tooth, one poorly judged charge of powder, one falling rock, and suddenly the body demands a hearing. In many gold rush settlements, medical care was scarce, uneven in quality, and often expensive, especially in the early boom phases. That was not a side problem, it was woven into daily life. Camps grew faster than trained doctors could arrive, and even when practitioners did appear, they worked with limited tools, uncertain supplies, and patients who had already spent weeks becoming ideal hosts for trouble. Exhaustion, poor diet, dirty water crowding. Cold heat and constant labour all prepared the stage nicely. Illness merely stepped into the light. You notice first how often men are patched rather than treated. A split hand bound with a rag, a burned wrist cooled in creek water, and then forgotten. A swollen ankle wrapped tight and stepped on anyway. Someone with a hacking cough insisting it is nothing. Someone else pale with fever but still upright from stubbornness or fear. The camp admires endurance because it has no choice, but admiration does not prevent infection. If anything, it encourages delayed wisdom. The sounds of sickness become part of the camp's background music. Coughing at dawn, not just one cough, but a whole scattered chorus. Groans from a bunkhouse corner where someone tries to roll over without involving his ribs. The scrape of a stool beside a bedroll. Water poured into a tin cup. A murmur from someone too tired to speak clearly. These are not dramatic sounds. That is what makes them unsettling. They settle in. They stay. You also begin to see how small injuries become large stories in a place like this. A blister opens, dirt gets in the boot, keeps rubbing, the man keeps working, and within days the foot is hot, angry and alarming. A nick from a tool seems trivial until the skin around it swells. A strange shoulder becomes a useless arm by evening. The modern instinct is to think, go get that checked. Camp life replies with what exactly and by whom and with what money. One peculiar and rather memorable detail from mining regions is the popularity of patent medicines and improvised cures sold with more confidence than evidence. Bottles promised relief for lungs, bowels, nerves, liver. blood, and nearly any complaint short of existential regret. Tonics, bitters, powders, syrups, liniments, oils, and pills circulated through camps with labels that implied science and contents that sometimes implied optimism. Men rubbed themselves, swallowed things, soaked rags, steeped herbs, and trusted whatever had helped somebody's cousin 2 camps over. When trained care is thin certainty itself becomes a medicine people are willing to buy. Of course, some camps did attract doctors, surgeons, or men calling themselves such, and their presence could make an enormous difference. A competent practitioner with instruments, some knowledge, and a steady hand was worth more than a cart full of frontier boasting. But even the best faced harsh conditions. Procedures might happen in poor light in cramped rooms with limited anaesthesia, few antiseptic practices by later standards, and anxious assistants trying not to faint or knock things over. The camp wanted modern medicine. What it often received was medicine fighting uphill through mud. Digestive sickness was common enough to inspire dread. Dirty water, spoiled food, poor sanitation, and crowding did not exactly create a health spa. Stomach complaints, diarrhea, fever, and general weakness could move through a camp with dispiriting speed. Respiratory troubles too found excellent conditions here, especially where dust, smoke, cold nights, damp bedding, and close quarters met. Add in overwork and thin diets, and the human frame began to resemble a house with too many windows open in bad weather. There is also the hard reality of accidents. Mining is repetitive, yes, but never tame. Tools glance off stone, loads shift, timber fails. A man slips in water. Another strains lifting more than sense allows. A wheel crushes a foot. Fire catches where it should not. Before deep industrialized mining even becomes the whole story, ordinary camp labor is already full of chances to injure yourself in surprisingly creative ways. The earth does not need malice to hurt you. Indifference works perfectly well. Experts still differ over which factor most damaged camp health: infectious disease, environmental exposure accidents, malnutrition, or chronic overwork. Each region and rush had its own pattern, and the evidence can tilt different ways. Yet from inside camp life, these categories blur into one another. A poorly fed man resists infection less well. A sleep-deprived man makes mistakes with tools. A crowded bunkhouse spreads illness. A wet week leads to chills, then weakness, then trouble. One hardship feeds the next with grim efficiency. You also notice how sickness rearranges social relations. A healthy man may boast that he needs nobody. Let him develop a fever, and suddenly he depends on tent mates, boarding house, women, friends from the diggings. Perhaps a neighbour who owes him nothing but still brings water. Care in camp is often informal, improvised, and deeply revealing. The loudest men are not always the kindest and the quietest. Sometimes turn out to be the ones who sit through the night, changing cloths and checking breath. Hard environments make dependency impossible to romanticize and impossible to escape. That dependency carried risks too. If you are ill for too long, someone may eye your claim. If you cannot work, your food costs do not politely stop. If you owe money, sickness makes the ledger crueler. A man can be frightened not only of pain, but of what pain does to his place in camp. The body becomes an economic liability the moment it falters. No wonder so many people kept going beyond wisdom. Tooth trouble deserves a special mention, partly because it was common, and partly because it introduces a uniquely frontier form of dread. A bad tooth in a mining camp can dominate your whole reality. You cannot sleep, chew, think, or speak without the pulse of it climbing into your skull. And if a dentist appears, the camp greets him with the blended relief and terror usually reserved for thunderstorms and tax collectors. Dentistry on the frontier was not famed for delicacy. Men have undoubtedly reconsidered entire life choices while staring at a chair in a canvas room. You pass one shelter where a man lies still under blankets while daylight glows at the edge of the flap. His boots sit outside, empty and accusing. Someone has left a cut by his hand. The smell inside is close and warm with sweat, medicine, damp cloth, smoke, and the faint sour note of illness. It strikes you then that health in a mining camp is not only about whether you live or die, it is about whether you can remain part of the moving world beyond the blanket. Once sickness pins you down, the camp goes on without waiting. There is a wider question that still occupies historians of labour and medicine. Were mining camps uniquely unhealthy, or were they simply concentrated versions of the ordinary 19th century world where disease and limited treatment were already common? The answer is probably both, which is the least tidy and most believable conclusion. The era itself was medically precarious by modern standards, and camps intensified that precariousness through crowding, mobility, sanitation failures, and punishing work. They took an already risky century and sharpened it. By evening, someone is limping back from the creek with a wrapped hand. Someone else has spent the day under cover, shivering through a fever. A man near the fire swears by a bottle, whose contents smell like regret and cloves. Another advises onions or mustard or rest, as if rest were stacked in barrels behind the store. The camp continues its steady muttering, but now you hear a fragile note under it. Bodies are failing around you in small ways all the time, and you understand perhaps more clearly than before why fortune in these places belonged not only to the lucky and the hard-working, but to the merely healthy. Gold might reward effort. Camp life rewarded the much duller miracle of waking up able to bend, lift, swallow, breathe, and keep going. Out here that counted as wealth too. By now the camp has taught you many things about mud, money, hunger, and the human back. Now it teaches you something larger and more complicated. You are not standing in a lonely wilderness populated by one neat category of prospector. You are standing in a crowded world of accents, habits, cuisines, tempers, prayers, jokes, and grievances imported from nearly everywhere. People had heard the word gold and decided to test their luck against it. At first, this feels almost thrilling. Walk a few dozen steps and you hear different rhythms of speech folding over one another. English in several forms, some crisp, some drawling, some thick with Ireland or Cornwall or Australia. Spanish passing between men by a cook fire, French over a pack saddle, Cantonese near a wash area where work is being done with extraordinary focus, perhaps German, perhaps Italian, perhaps a language you cannot identify at all, but remember later as part of the camp's constant hum. A gold rush settlement is rough, yes, but also unexpectedly global. It has all the polish of a kicked barrel, and all the diversity of a port city dropped in the mud. This is not an illusion created by a few colourful travellers. Mining booms across the 19th century drew migrants from many regions and continents, and California in particular became remarkably international in composition during the height of the rush. People came from Latin America, China, Europe, Australia and elsewhere, not merely as passing curiosities, but as workers, traders, cooks, teamsters, entertainers, labour organisers and rivals. The camp may look temporary, but the world has arrived inside it. You notice the difference first through practical things. Cooking smells vary from one part of camp to another. One fire gives off the familiar weight of beans and pork. Another carries garlic, onions, or spices that seem almost luxurious after weeks of smoke and salt. Bread may look different from one tent to the next. So may tools hats' ways of packing, mules' methods of washing gravel, and styles of building shelter. Even the rhythms of work shift slightly. One group sings, another works in focused silence, another talks steadily while labouring using conversation like an extra hand. This variety can be useful. People trade skills as much as goods. Someone knows a better way to shore a trench. Someone else understands drainage. Another group has experience from earlier goldfields in another country and knows exactly how to organise labour around water flow. News travels across these networks too, sometimes more reliably than official notices. A man who shares little language with you may still show you with a gesture how to brace a rocker box or patch a boot. Cooperation often begins not in sentiment but in usefulness, and yet camp life is never content with harmony for long, because alongside exchange comes suspicion, Alongside curiosity comes prejudice. Men already tired, underfed, and worried about claims do not always respond gracefully to difference. When work is scarce, when prices rise, when rumours spread that one group is undercutting another, or securing better ground, or sticking too much to themselves, or not enough. Resentment can harden quickly. The camp loves categories almost as much as it loves gossip. It sorts people by language, dress, food, faith, skin colour, and rumour, then acts shocked when the sorting turns ugly. In many mining regions, immigrant communities face discrimination, violence, special taxes, exclusionary rules, and social hostility, even while contributing enormously to camp economies and labour systems. Chinese miners in California, for example, often endured legal and informal barriers that reflected broad anti-Chinese prejudice, yet they remained central to the mining world through persistent skill and community organisation. That is not an incidental side note. It is part of the architecture of camp life. The dream of easy fortune often sat right beside the old habit of deciding who deserved a chance at it. You can feel this tension in the ordinary geography of the camp. Certain groups cluster together for safety, familiarity, language, and trade. Some boarding houses welcome everyone who can pay. Others do not. Some cook tents become informal social centres for a particular community. Paths through camp start carrying identity. The hill where certain workers sleep, the creek bend where another group gathers, the store that extends credit to some and not others. These patterns are not always officially declared. They do not need to be. Human beings are perfectly capable of drawing borders with glances and habits. Still, the camp resists simple division because need keeps tangling everyone together. A mule must be hired, a shirt must be washed, a claim needs labour, a wagon wheel needs repair. Flour must be bought, news must be exchanged. A man may distrust his neighbour's language and still require his services by noon. He may mock another group's food and then buy supper from them by nightfall, because hunger has no patience for ideology. The practical life of the camp keeps puncturing the foolish certainties people build around identity. One wonderfully revealing little detail from some mining settlements is how quickly words themselves travelled. Camp slang absorbed terms. Accents bent other accents. Food names crossed from one tongue to another, and men who claimed foreignness made them uneasy could still be found borrowing phrases with perfect shamelessness. Language in the diggings behaved a bit like water in a ditch. It went where it could, carrying traces of everything it touched. Even prejudice apparently can be linguistically flexible when convenience demands it. You also notice the emotional dimensions of living among strangers from everywhere. For some, the camp feels broader, because of it less lonely, almost exciting in its mix of songs, stories, and customs. For others, it feels destabilizing. Home becomes harder to define when every fire seems to represent some other elsewhere. A man from Cornwall may find comfort hearing a familiar cadence 2 tents over. Another may feel newly displaced hearing 10 unfamiliar ones. The camp expands the world while making many people long more sharply for their own small corner of it. Interpretations differ on whether these multi-ethnic camps should be seen chiefly as rough laboratories of coexistence or as sites where competition sharpened older hierarchies into new frontier forms. Some accounts emphasize exchange adaptation and the sheer practical interdependence of camp life. Others point to exclusion violence and the way legal and informal discrimination structured who could prosper and who was always kept precarious. You do not need to force a tidy answer. Walk the camp for a few evenings and you will encounter both realities within the same hour. One fire offers music unlike anything you heard at home, quick and bright, carrying over the dark while tired men grin in spite of themselves. Another cluster nearby mutters about foreigners taking good ground. At a store, 2 men bargain clumsily across a language barrier and end with both parties irritated yet satisfied. At a water source, a joke lands imperfectly, then somehow becomes shared laughter anyway. Later, outside a saloon, an insult rooted in race or nationality sparks a fight that had been looking for an excuse all along. This is the camp in full. Exchange and hostility, borrowing and blame, curiosity and fear, nothing pure, everything mixed. You begin to understand that the camp is not merely a collection of miners, it is a compressed world economy with shovels. Goods, labour, rumour and resentment all move through it. So do dishes, songs, small kindnesses and old grudges imported across oceans. Even the land itself is entangled in these human layers, especially when one remembers that many gold rushes unfolded on or near indigenous homelands already under pressure, violence or outright dispossession. The camp may speak as though it began when the miners arrived. The ground knows otherwise. As evening falls, smoke lifts from many fires and supper scents drift together into one impossible mixture. Bacon stew onions, unfamiliar spices, coffee damp wood, perhaps a little bread if fortune or skill have been kind. Voices rise and fall in half the world's cadences. Lanterns glow through cloth and plank. Somewhere a man is telling a joke nobody outside his group fully understands yet. Everyone laughs a little because the tone carries well enough. A child cries. A fiddle answers another tune from farther off. The night gathers them all. And standing there hearing the camp breathe in many tongues, you realise the gold rush did not simply summon fortune seekers. It pulled the world into uneasy proximity and made people negotiate difference with dirty boots, tired tempers and very immediate needs. Sometimes that produced generosity, sometimes cruelty, often both before breakfast. In a place built on chance, even neighbourliness becomes a kind of gamble. After enough days in the diggings, you start to notice that not everything in camp can be explained by labour, luck, or poor planning. Though poor planning remains a very busy force, people begin carrying little habits around with them. Private protections against uncertainty, a certain hat worn only on promising days, a coin kept in the pocket but never spent, a prayer murmured before stepping into the creek, a refusal to begin work if a shovel slips from the hand before dawn, a way of tapping the pan twice before washing gravel, as if the river itself appreciates ceremony. At first you might smile at this, perhaps even with a trace of superiority. Then a week of bad luck passes, your back aches, your supper, tastes of smoke and defeat, and suddenly the idea of a lucky pebble tucked into your vest does not seem entirely absurd. That is one of the quieter truths of camp life. Where chance rules openly, superstition never has to sneak in through the window. It is invited to the fire and given a cup. Religion was present in many mining communities from very early on. Ministers, itinerant preachers, Catholic priests, lay leaders, revival meetings, prayer circles, funerals, and Sunday gatherings all appeared in camps that outsiders often described as godless or lawless. Some men attended faithfully, some rediscovered devotion when luck turned sour. Others kept their distance unless sickness, loneliness, or a burial drew them near. In a world of unstable claims and unstable bodies, faith offered something the camp itself almost never did, which was continuity. You may come across a service held in a tent under a tree or in a rough plank room cleared of cards for the occasion. The benches wobble, hats come off. Someone clears his throat in the sort of silence that only forms when a noisy place briefly remembers reverence. The smell is still camp smell, smoke-damp wool leather. Tired bodies, maybe a trace of coffee from a nearby pot, because frontier holiness does not arrive with polished brass and fresh lilies. But the tone shifts, voices lower. Even the men least inclined toward piety seem relieved by the pause. It is not hard to see why. The camp works on appetite and rumour. Faith works on rhythm. A hymn sung together pulls breath into order. A prayer names fears the camp usually hides under joking. A sermon, even a mediocre one, reminds listeners that not everything valuable can be weighed in dust. That may sound lofty, but in practice it can be very simple. A man who has spent 10 days thinking only of gravel and bacon grease may need quite badly to hear language not directly related to his shovel. And yet belief in the diggings does not remain neatly confined to formal religion. It spread sideways into charms, omens, folk remedies, lucky routines, and whispered warnings. Some miners avoid beginning work on certain days. Some distrust certain birds, dreams, or accidents of timing. Others keep relics from home, lockets, scraps of cloth, a mother's letter, a saint's medal, a pressed flower gone brown at the edges, less because these items promise wealth than because they steady the heart. One particularly odd camp habit recorded in various frontier settings involved people refusing to shave, wash a shirt, or alter some small routine, while a streak of luck held for fear that cleanliness itself might offend fortune. Personal grooming apparently could become a metaphysical risk. You see how quickly rumour grows spiritual edges too. A creek acquires a reputation. A hollow in the hills is said to favour some men and punish others. Someone insists a certain claim was cursed after 3 owners failed in succession. Another swears he dreamed of a rich strike and found colour exactly where the dream suggested, which is the sort of story camp life adores because it combines greed with mystery and demands no proof at all. The rational mind does not disappear here. It simply grows tired and shares a bunk with imagination. There is a wider point beneath all this. Gold itself encourages magical thinking. You cannot see enough of it most days to feel secure. You cannot predict exactly where it lies. 2 men work side by side and one finds enough to cheer the other almost nothing. Labour matters certainly, and skill matters too, but luck remains so visible that it begins to feel like a character in camp, moody, selective, almost personified. Once fortune acquires personality, people naturally start trying to charm it. Writers and historians have long disagreed over whether frontier superstition is best understood as comic folklore, practical psychology, or a genuine alternative system of meaning. Some emphasize how these beliefs helped miners cope with uncertainty, danger, and loneliness. Others warn against treating them too lightly because to the people live in them, they were not decorative nonsense, but part of how the world made emotional sense. Standing by a fire while a tired man explains why he never works a fresh patch without touching the brim of his hat 3 times, you can see the wisdom in taking such habits seriously, even if not literally, and faith itself was not the same for everyone. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Buddhists, practitioners of Chinese folk religion, men raised with formal creeds, men who had not prayed in years all might pass through the same camp. Some worshipped publicly, some privately, some built community through shared rituals, feast days, or sacred objects. Others became more private the farther they got from home, carrying belief like a banked coal rather than a campfire. A mining camp could be harshly divided in many ways, but spiritual life rarely followed only one pattern. It multiplied, adapted, and made room for improvisation just like the camp itself. You also notice how often religion meets death here. A burial sharpens everyone. Men who spent the week joking coarsely and cheating at cards suddenly stand still with hats in hand. The sound of earth on a coffin or wrapped body is enough to make even the least reflective soul think bigger thoughts for a moment. Funerals in camp could be simple, hurried moving or strangely makeshift, but they mattered. They reminded people that fortune had limits and the ground was always taking more than gold from those who dug at it. At the same time, the camp never stops being itself. A prayer meeting may break up and immediately be followed by an argument over boots. A man may listen solemnly to scripture on Sunday and lose his week's money at cards by nightfall. Someone might wear a crucifix and a lucky bone charm together without seeing the slightest contradiction. Frontier life has very little interest in neat categories. It welcomes sincerity and inconsistency with equal warmth. There is also a continuing debate among scholars about whether religion truly civilized the camps in the way older histories often claimed, or whether that language simply flatters moral reformers while underestimating the complexity of camp life. Certainly churches, missions, and religious figures helped create routines, mutual aid schools, and social expectations in some places, But camps were not wild voids waiting for respectability to descend from a wagon. They were already full societies, ragged and noisy and improvised. Faith entered them as one force among many, not as the sole inventor of conscience. By evening, as the air cools and smoke softens into the dusk, you see a man touch the brim of his hat before folding into his blanket. Another turns a ring on his finger and looks for a long moment into the fire. Somewhere nearby a prayer is spoken quietly in a language you do not know. Farther off, a joke about bad luck earns tired laughter around a lantern. Someone hangs a charm over a bunk. Someone refuses to move a stone from beside his tent because it has seen him through 3 lean weeks. It all blends together, the formal and the improvised, the sacred and the superstitious, the chapel and the lucky spoon. And perhaps that mixture is exactly what the camp produces. In a place where tomorrow's fortune can hinge on gravel weather illness, and one more day of endurance, people reach for whatever gives shape to uncertainty. A hymn, a token, a habit, a whispered appeal to heaven, a ritual no one back home would understand. You do not need to believe every story to understand why they thrive here. When luck governs the daylight, people naturally go looking for protection after dark. Sooner or later, the easy ground grows stingy. That is the moment the camp changes its posture. In the beginning, so many men picture gold waiting politely in stream beds ready to be teased loose by Pan and patience. But surface deposits do not last forever, and rumour has a cruel habit of outliving geology. So when the shallow washings thin out, when the bright little flakes no longer justify the same old motions, the camp turns inward and downward. It starts clawing at the earth more seriously, and the earth, having tolerated this entire spectacle with poor grace, begins to push back. The first sign is timber. You see more posts, beams, braces, planks and rough frameworks stacked near working areas. Men talk less about pans and more about shafts, drifts, tunnels, and the best way to keep a wall from becoming suddenly theoretical. The sounds change too. Less water swilling, more hammering underground. More dull thuds from picks biting harder ground. More creaks that make the skin along your arms tighten before your mind has time to explain why. A deep claim has a different atmosphere from a creekside dig. It feels closer, heavier, more secretive, as if the land has decided not to give anything up without an argument. This shift happened in many gold regions as the earliest place opportunities declined, and miners moved toward more complex extraction, whether through deeper pits, shafts, hard rock mining, or larger organised systems. It was not just a technical change, it transformed camp life. Deeper work demanded more capital, more coordination, more equipment, and far more risk. The lone hopeful with a pan did not vanish overnight, but the mythology of individual fortune began rubbing against the reality that the deeper earth often favoured teams, companies, and men with backing. You approach one of these workings and the air itself feels different. Cooler at the entrance, but not fresher. There is a mineral smell, damp stone, disturbed clay, old wood, sweat, lamp smoke, and something stale beneath it all. The scent of air that has lingered too long where lungs are expected to trust it. The ground around the shaft is scarred by spoil heaps, boot prints, broken rock and scattered tools. Men move in and out with a compressed kind of concentration. Nobody wastes gestures here. Even the jokes come shorter. When you descend, whether by ladder, rough footholds, or some improvised arrangement that would give a modern inspector palpitations, the world narrows instantly. Light changes first. Day fades into lamp glow and shadow. Sound changes next. The camp above becomes distant, replaced by drips, muffled blows. A scrape of metal boots shifting on unstable ground, someone calling from farther down a passage. Then the body notices the rest. The air may feel thin, damp, dusty, or all three. Your shoulders draw inward. Your breath acquires caution. Underground work teaches humility in seconds. And the danger is not theatrical. It is ordinary, which makes it worse. Shaft collapses, falling rock-bad air, flooding misfired, blasting rotten timbers and unstable ground were part of mining life in deeper operations across many rushes and later camp phases. That is simply one of the established realities of extractive work. People did shore tunnels, ventilate where possible, and learn from experience, yes. But experience is not a guarantee. In a mine, small errors can remain quiet until the exact moment they become enormous. You begin to understand why miners paid such attention to timbering. A support beam is not a dull carpentry matter down here. It is a promise between the living and the weight above them. Men study wood grain, listen for strain test walls with tools, and read dampness like a warning. The earth is always shifting a little. A settling creak can mean nothing, or everything. Underground, your nerves become listening instruments. Then there is the air itself, that intimate necessity people ignore until it turns hostile. Poor ventilation could leave underground spaces thick with dust, smoke from blasting, or gases that made breathing difficult or dangerous. A candle burning oddly, a lamp wavering, a miner growing light-headed. These were not merely inconveniences, they were messages. Some were understood in time, some were not. You do not fully appreciate fresh air until you have doubted the next breath. One wonderfully strange and slightly unnerving tidbit from mining lore is the way some workers trusted small creatures' flame behaviour or local feel as informal warnings underground. Not always in a systematic way, and certainly not with modern precision, but enough to show how sensitive people became to tiny signals. A lamp doing something unusual, a sudden change in smell, a silence where there should have been dripping. Men who spent enough time below developed instincts that outsiders might mock right up until the moment those instincts saved a life. The labour itself grows harsher. Hard rock does not swill obediently through a pan. It must be broken, hauled, crushed, sorted, processed. Everything becomes heavier. Ore sacks drag at the shoulders, ladders punish the knees, tools jar the arms, dust gets into the throat and stays there. Your muscles ache differently after underground work, less from repeated bending than from strain hauling, bracing, and the constant tension of working where the walls are not guaranteed to remain where they began. And with greater danger often comes greater hierarchy. Once mining requires machinery, capital, engineering, knowledge, and organised labour independence starts to thin out. Some men become wage earners in someone else's venture. Others manage crews. A few own shares, many simply work. There is an ongoing debate among historians about whether this transition from surface prospecting to deeper, more organised mining marks the end of the true gold rush spirit, or merely its inevitable maturation. It depends perhaps on whether you are sentimental about freedom or practical about extraction. The earth itself seems not to care. It gives its metal on terms that favour scale. Blasting introduces another layer of dread. Powder must be handled, placed, timed, and respected. Respected is a very useful frontier word. It means feared by people too proud to say feared. A charge that fails to behave properly turns a worksite into a bundle of suspended nerves. Men wait, listen, warn one another, decide whether to trust the silence. The mountain has a way of making every delay dramatic. You also see what deeper work does to the camp above ground. It changes the economy. Blacksmiths matter more, teamsters matter more. Timber iron, rope, lamps, machinery parts, and skilled labour become more central. Companies edge in, investors sniff around. Hope becomes more expensive and less personal. The camp still tells stories of lone luck because camps adore old stories, but the future increasingly belongs to organised effort and men who can afford delay equipment and loss. For many ordinary miners, that is a bitter revelation. They came to wrestle fortune from the stream with their own hands. Instead, they find themselves becoming one labouring piece in a larger mechanism. Some observers once romanticised deep mining as proof of grit and enterprise triumphing over nature. Others have stressed the bodily cost, the industrial discipline, and the way risk shifted downward onto workers while profit floated upward. Standing under a low roof of earth and timber, while your lamp throws restless shadows on wet stone, the second reading gains force. Heroism is one word for this, necessity is another, and yet men keep going below. Why? Because the surface has disappointed them. Because debts need paying. Because rumours say the deeper vein is rich. Because somebody nearby truly did pull out impressive ore last month. Because work underground, for all its terrors, may offer wages steadier than aimless prospecting. Because once you have invested this much of yourself, it becomes hard to accept that the ground owes you nothing. By the time you climb back into daylight, blinking at the sudden width of the sky, the camp feels oddly airy and flimsy above you. Smoke rises from cook fires, voices carry. A mule stamps near a wagon. Ordinary life resumes its muddy clatter. But you have been underneath it now, beneath the noise and the boasting and the store counters and the little domestic miracles of clean shirts and hot coffee. You have been where the earth presses back, and that leaves a sore mark. Gold Rush camps like to imagine themselves as places where men conquered the frontier by sheer will. Down in the shafts that fantasy phrase badly. The ground is not a stage for your ambition. It is a weight, a pressure, a shifting thing with very old habits. It may yield, it may bury. Often, it does a bit of both. Most people could not handle that for long, which is why the deeper the camp digs, the more it begins to reveal what this entire enterprise has always really been, not a treasure hunt, but a negotiation with danger that the earth has no obligation to honour. By now you've learned how to wake in smoke, work in mud, eat in repetition, and sleep beside noises no civilized architect would ever permit. You've learned the weight of a shovel, the price of coffee, the politics of boundaries, the moods of weather, and the unsettling truth that even the earth seems to hold grudges. But there is one burden camp life keeps for later almost as a private cruelty. Homesickness. It does not always arrive dramatically. It rarely announces itself with tears and violins, though the camp at night can certainly produce both under the right amount of whiskey. More often it slips in during small pauses, while waiting for water to boil, while mending a torn cuff by dim light, while hearing some stranger laugh in a way that reminds you of a cousin, a brother, a wife, a friend you have not seen in months or years. It appears when a loaf smells briefly like home, or when rain on canvas sounds just enough like rain on a roof to make your chest tighten before you can explain why. Distance in a Gold Rush camp was not merely geographical, it was emotional and practical. Migrants often lived for long stretches with an uncertain contact from home, dependent on irregular mail passing. Travellers or newspapers that arrived late and incomplete. A letter could take weeks or months. News travelled slowly and silence travelled faster. That fact alone shaped the emotional life of the camps more than many dramatic accounts care to admit. You begin to understand this the first time someone asks whether the post has come. The question moves through camp with an energy entirely different from rumours about claims. Men who normally affect rugged indifference suddenly become attentive. They drift toward the point of arrival, a store counter, a notice board, a tent, a wagon, a clerk with a list, a man with a sack of envelopes and the temporary power of a monarch. Faces sharpen, jokes get thinner. A person can tell himself for weeks that he does not care that he came west to make a future rather than look backward. Then one scrap of paper in familiar handwriting appears, and suddenly the whole frontier performance wobbles. The reading of letters is its own small theatre. Some men open them at once, almost greedily, then turn away to absorb them in private if privacy can be stolen. Others delay for a few minutes staring at the seal, as if the unopened envelope contains not news but a doorway. A few who cannot read well ask friends to read aloud, which is the tender and risky thing in a place where dignity is usually guarded with such effort. Every word from home carries more than content. It carries tone, smell, imagined through paper, the shape of a remembered room, the old grammar of being known by people who understood you before you became this smoky, mud-caked version of yourself. And of course, not everyone receives one. That may be the hardest part. Watching another man grin faintly over a letter from a wife, mother, or sister while your own hands remain empty. He tries not to show too much. You try not to mind it too much. The camp has all sorts of visible inequalities, money, gear, claims, luck, but this one can feel the most private and the most raw. To be written to is proof that you still occupy space in someone else's daily thought. To be forgotten or merely delayed by circumstance can feel like erasure wearing innocent clothes. One curious and rather moving detail from camp correspondence is how often people preserved letters long after they had nearly disintegrated, folded and unfolded, till the creases softened, tucked into pockets, boxes, hats, or Bible pages. A miner might carry a single sheet for months, rereading lines until they were half memorized, as if paper itself could continue radiating companionship. Ink becomes a kind of shelter. You can see why. In a camp where almost everything is provisional, a letter offers continuity in the hand. Writing back is another matter. It sounds simple until you actually attempt it after a day in the diggings. You sit by the lantern or candle shoulders, aching, fingers stiff, smoke drifting through the room, noise leaking in from outside, and try to explain your life in words that will make sense to someone far away. Do you tell the truth? That you are tired all the time, dirty most of the time, uncertain all of the time, that the glorious opportunity looks increasingly like hard labour with occasional glitter? Or do you soften it? Mention the scenery, mention a promising patch, mention perseverance, downplay the beans, downplay the cough, downplay the fact that your boots seem to have entered a personal feud with your feet. Many letters from mining frontiers mixed hope, complaint, performance, and omission in fascinating proportions. That is one of the sturdy realities of the record. People wrote to reassure, to boast, to ask for supplies, to beg forgiveness, to encourage family to join them, to warn family to stay away, or simply to hear themselves sounding purposeful on paper. The frontier self and the written self were not always identical. Few of us, after all, are eager to post home a full inventory of our poor decisions. There is also the ache of time passing elsewhere. Someone's child grows while he's away. A parent ages, a harvest is gathered. A shop changes hands, a neighbour marries, a friend dies. A road back home gets paved or washed out or renamed, and you are not there to see it. The camp teaches a brutal lesson in simultaneity. While you're standing shin-deep in cold water, peering into a pan, whole worlds continue without you. The sense of missing your own life can be more exhausting than labour. Interpretations vary on whether homesickness in the goldfields should be understood mainly as private sentiment or as a major structural force shaping who stayed, who left, and how communities formed. Some writers have treated it almost playfully as the temporary weakness of men not yet hardened to frontier reality. Others read it as central a deep emotional pressure that influenced work, marriage, mobility, risk-taking, and morale. Out here among the bedrolls and tin cups, the second view feels more convincing. Longing is not a decorative emotion. It alters decisions. You see that longing in objects too. A photograph wrapped in cloth, a ribbon in a trunk, a ring touched absent-mindedly. A recipe remembered but impossible to reproduce exactly because the camp insists on turning all memory into approximation. Men speak of home in sensory fragments. The sound of a gate, the smell of apple peel by a stove, the feel of proper bedding, a street after rain, church bells, the shade of a particular tree. It is rarely the grandest things that return first. Homesickness likes small domestic details because they wound more accurately. Sometimes the camp tries to defend itself against this ache with comedy. Men mock each other for sentiment. Someone reads a sugary line from a sweetheart's letter in an exaggerated voice until even the recipient laughs. Another swears he misses nothing except proper pie and quiet. But underneath the teasing lies recognition. Everyone misses something. Even the most boastful soul eventually betrays himself by describing a mother's kitchen, a city street, a harbour smell, a farm dog, a child's hair, a winter fire. And then there are the men who cannot go back, at least not easily. Too little money, too much pride, too many promises already made to leave without success may feel worse than staying miserable. So homesickness becomes not merely yearning, but captivity. The camp holds you between two humiliations, failure here or return without glory. No wonder some men linger long after hope ought to have packed for them. By night, when the lanterns burn lower, and the camp's noise thins into pockets of talk songs, snoring and distant argument, the feeling grows stronger. Darkness makes memory louder. You sit with a letter on your knee, or with no letter at all, and listen to the soft movements of tired people settling. Outside, smoke drifts under the stars. Somewhere nearby, someone is reading. By a flicker of light, lips moving just slightly over familiar words. Another man lies awake with his arm over his eyes, not sleeping, not speaking, perhaps seeing another place entirely. And you understand then that goal camps do not only test a fluid body, they test attachment. They ask whether ambition can outshout memory, whether distance can be tolerated long enough to become profitable, whether a person can stand in the mud among strangers and not slowly ache himself hollow for the sound of one known voice saying his name the old way. Most cannot manage that forever, which is why so many letters from the goldfields, even the hopeful ones, seem to carry two stories at once. One about fortune still ahead and another about home already slipping out of reach. And still, despite everything, despite the mud, the beans, the coughing in the dark, the claim quarrels, the soaked blankets, the lousy coffee, that somehow still feels sacred, the camp goes on believing in winners. It needs them. Not many, mind you. Just enough to keep the machinery of hope properly oiled. One man with a fat poke of dust. One boarding house tale about a fellow who struck a rich pocket and bought out 3 neighbouring claims. One rumour of a miner who arrived ragged and now walks about with the serene, irritating air of someone who no longer has to price onions individually. That's all it takes. The gold rush does not run on widespread success. It runs on visible exceptions. You begin to notice how the camp studies these fortunate few. A miner who has genuinely done well carries an atmosphere around him, though it is not always the one outsiders imagine. Sometimes he becomes louder, suddenly generous, buying drinks and receiving admirers he did not know he had. Sometimes he grows guarded, instead glancing over his shoulder, speaking less aware that money and dust attract stories, lenders, thieves and cousins of uncertain legitimacy. Some successful men leave quickly, others linger and try to convert luck into position, perhaps buying better equipment, hiring help, opening a store, investing in transport, or moving from the creek into the more stable role of person who profits from other men's aching backs. That shift is one of the central truths of mining country. A minority did make substantial gains from the rushes, but many of the most reliable fortunes were built not by solitary prospectors with miraculous pans, but by merchants, suppliers, transport operators, landholders, and later investors in more organized extraction. The image of the lone miner becoming wealthy with his own hand survives because it is irresistibly dramatic. The numbers where they can be traced suggest a much narrower path to genuine prosperity. Yet camp life gives a certain glow to anyone who looks as if he has beaten the odds. Men watch his boots, his purchases, the cut of his coat, if he has upgraded the quality of tobacco, he smokes, the room he rents, the way he pays cash or dust carelessly, or with the lingering caution of a man still half afraid the fortune may vanish if jostled. Success is never merely private there, it becomes cold weather, and because the camp is camp, it also breeds counterfeit success. You quickly learn that seeming prosperous and being prosperous are not the same thing. A man may display dust today and be ruined by cards next week. Another may buy a new hat on credit and let everyone assume the vein is paying out splendidly. A third may talk so confidently about a pending sale or partnership that listeners begin to treat the imagined money as though it has already arrived. Mining camps are full of anticipatory triumph prosperity announced slightly ahead of schedule confidence worn as camouflage against insolvency. One wonderfully revealing frontier oddity is the way men sometimes spent their first lucky returns on objects meant less for utility than for proof. A better coat, polished boots, a watch chain, a broad hat, an extravagant dinner, a hotel room, perhaps a pocket mirror or scented soap if they wished to declare war on recent history. These purchases were not always foolish, they were symbolic. A person starved of comfort will occasionally buy evidence that the world can still be soft. At the same time, you begin to see the larger and grimmer pattern. For every lucky man in camp, there are dozens circling debt disappointment and that stubborn, dangerous conviction that one more week will change everything. Some borrow against future findings. Some sell tools, then buy them back later. Some take wage work to stay afloat while telling themselves they remain independent. Others drift from claim to claim, rumour to rumour, never prosperous enough to leave, never broken enough to stop. Hope here is elastic to the point of menace. You hear the arithmetic everywhere. How much a man cleared last month, how much he lost in supplies, what the store still holds against his name, whether a partner ran off, whether a claim might pay if only they had capital for timber water rights, labour blasting powder, a horse, another set of hands, a pump, a better stretch of channel, a less cursed patch of earth. The vocabulary of almost becomes a dialect of its own, almost rich, almost through the rough part, almost onto a better lead, almost ready to cash out, almost home free. Camp life survives on almost, and this produces a special kind of emotional weather, the mix of envy and admiration that settles around every success story. A man who does well may inspire the rest. He may also irritate them beyond reason, simply by existing. His luck flatters their hope while insulting their effort. If he struck rich after months of work, the camp salutes him more generously. If he stumbled onto a rich pocket early, people become philosophical in a very strained way. Everyone claims luck is part of the game. Nobody enjoys being reminded quite how large a part. There is a lively dispute among historians about whether the gold rushes should be understood primarily as engines of opportunity, or as vast systems of disappointment punctuated by a handful of public triumphs. Some emphasize social mobility, entrepreneurship, and the real fortunes that did emerge. Others stress the overwhelming number of disappointed migrants whose labour enriched others more reliably than themselves. From inside the camp, these are not opposing stories. They are simultaneous. Opportunity is visible enough to be maddening. Failure is widespread enough to be ordinary. You see it at dusk especially clearly. One man returns with a grin too carefully controlled to be concealed. Another carries his pan with the flat, tired indifference of somebody who found little and has run out of theatrical responses. A third has had enough success to pay his board for the week and not much more, which in camp terms counts as a respectable moral victory. Nearby, a merchant tallies figures in a notebook and comes out ahead regardless of whose pan glittered. The camp applauds luck, but the ledger keeps calmer counsel. Even among those who do prosper, prosperity itself is unstable. Gold must be safeguarded, sold invested, moved defended. A lucky strike can vanish into high prices. Bad partnerships, theft, gambling, poor judgment or expansion undertaken just when the seam thins. Sudden gain is not the same as durable wealth. The camp knows many men who are doing very well for precisely 8 days. Frontier fortune has a fondness for short engagements. Some miners manage the transition better. They stop digging and start supplying. They purchase interests and claims rather than wield picks themselves. They lend money. They open boarding houses, butcher shops, freight services, say offices. In this way, the shrewdest winners often move away from the romantic centre of the story and toward its practical edges. Gold may have lured them west, but regular profit teaches them to love freight flour tools, meat housing and transport. It is almost disappointingly sensible. Heroic legend wants gleaming nuggets. Real wealth often prefers invoices, and then there are the ones who cannot stop chasing even after decent success. This may be the camp's saddest pattern of all. A man finds enough to settle comfortably elsewhere, but stays because what if the next strike is bigger? He turns a good result into another gamble, then another. The dream does not end when met. It mutates. Gold Rush life teaches people to measure themselves against possibility, and possibility is a greedy ruler. By night, stories of the fortunate few circulate again through the tents, cookhouses and saloons. Somebody really did strike a better patch upstream. Somebody bought a team. Somebody sent home money enough to clear a family debt. Somebody else is rumoured to have hidden gold dust in a flour sack, a boot heel, or inside a Bible, which would be either clever or sacrilegious depending on your point of view. Around these stories the rest of the camp breathes and listens. Men who have earned almost nothing still straighten slightly. Tomorrow remains available. The earth might yet apologise. And that is the true power of the few who prosper. They do not merely win for themselves. They keep everybody else from quitting. Because if one man can do it, then perhaps your soreness means something, your bad meals mean something, your homesickness means something, your weeks of muddy disappointment are not the whole story. Perhaps the camp has not been mocking you. Perhaps it has only been testing you. Perhaps your turn is still walking toward you through the dark. Most men in camp live by that, perhaps. Very few get to cash it. Eventually the camp begins to thin. Not all at once. There is no grand trumpet announcing the end of belief, no dignified procession of disappointed men filing toward the horizon with lesson learned and character improved. That would be much too tidy for a mining camp. Instead, people start slipping away in ones and twos. A tent stands empty in the morning. A bunk goes cold. A claim lies quiet for a day, then another. A man sells his pan, then his shovel, then insists he is merely heading to a better creek over the ridge, which may be true, though the tone usually suggests that truth is being gently stretched for morale. You notice the departures because camp life makes every presence familiar. Even people you never properly meet become part of the daily scenery. The fellow who coughed through dawn and always wore the same tilted hat. The pair who argued over coffee proportions every evening. The quiet man near the lower creek who panned with maddening patience. The woman who sold bread on wash day. Then one morning they are simply not there, and the camp absorbs the absence with that frontier mixture of curiosity, gossip, and practical indifference. This too was part of the historical rhythm. Mining populations were often highly mobile, with people drifting constantly between camp strikes, wage work, transport jobs, supply trades, and the long, humiliating road back home. Many never found lasting success. Some cut their losses early. Others stayed until money, health, luck, or self-deception ran out. The romance of the gold rush prefers arrival scenes. Daily reality produced just as many exits. The reasons for leaving vary, and camp life loves to speculate about them. One man is said to have struck modestly and gone off sensible, which in a mining camp almost counts as sainthood. Another has debts and left before the ledger could catch up with his face. Someone else has taken sick and been moved out to recover or not recover elsewhere. A pair of partners split and neither has the energy to maintain the old story. A family packs up because the camp never became less hard, only more familiar in its hardness. And always there are those chasing the next rumour because gold country breeds migration the way damp blankets breed complaints. You watch a wagon being loaded at dawn and it tells its own story. A rolled mattress tied badly, a few crates, picks and pans with their shine worn off at the grip, a chair too awkward to abandon, a trunk that looks heavier than the life inside it ought to permit. Tin plates, a kettle-patched canvas, one surviving lantern, perhaps a box of letters, perhaps a child's blanket, perhaps a mirror wrapped in cloth. Frontier possessions are revealing. They show what someone thought worth carrying away after everything else proved negotiable. There is a melancholy smell to departure. Dust shaken from bedding, damp wood, old canvas, mule sweat, rope, cold morning smoke from a fire already going out. You stand nearby pretending not to stare and feel that strange camp emotion that is half sympathy, half self-protection. If you look too closely at somebody else leaving, with less than he hoped for, you may have to ask whether your own future is simply delayed embarrassment. And sometimes it is worse than embarrassment. Some people leave with injuries that linger, lungs that never quite forgive, the dust backs altered by strained hands permanently roughened, savings thinned to almost nothing, and a mind full of stories nobody back home will entirely understand. A man may have come for wealth and depart with a cough, a limp, and a suspicious relationship to stew. The camp keeps excellent records in the body, even when the ledger books lose interest. One revealing little oddity from mining districts is how often men carried away souvenirs of failed ambition that were oddly modest. A promising stone, an unusual nugget too small to change a life but too meaningful to discard a dented pan, a lucky spoon, a battered hat, even a jar of dust not worth much but worth the memory. People do not always leave grand enterprises with grand relics. Sometimes they leave with one object that says, "I was there and that will have to do." You also begin to see how departure is staged to preserve dignity. Very few announce I have been defeated by weather prices, fatigue, terrible coffee, and my own optimism. Instead, they frame it differently. There is a better opportunity elsewhere. A new strike has been reported. A partner is waiting downriver. Business in town looks promising. Family matters require attention. One must be practical. One has done well enough. There is nearly always a reason, and perhaps the reason is even true, but under it all sits the quieter fact that the camp has extracted its price and not paid enough in return. Some interpreters of frontier life argue that mobility itself was a sign of resilience, not failure. People moved because they were adaptable, alert to changing conditions, willing to seek advantage. Others point out that constant movement often reflected instability, disappointment, exclusion, or the inability to build anything secure before the ground, the market, or the social order shifted again. In the camp you can see both. Leaving may be intelligent. Leaving may also be surrender with better phrasing. And then there are the vanishings that become legend because no one quite knows what happened. A man sells half his things and disappears before dawn. Another goes to inspect a rumoured claim and never returns to this camp, whether because he prospered elsewhere, failed elsewhere, or found reasons never to explain himself. A third is last seen at cards or on the road or heading toward the ferry. Mining camps generate missing people the way cities generate rumours. Too much movement, too little paperwork, too many reinventions. The place itself seems designed to help a person slip out of one life and into another, or out of sight entirely. The camp responds to departures with an odd combination of sentiment and immediate reuse. A bunk empties and someone else takes it. A claim lies idle, and neighbours begin wondering how long that idleness counts. A storekeeper marks an account closed or unpaid. A spare shovel changes hands. Canvas gets repatched into another shelter. This may seem cold, but camp life has always been economical with grief. Things must keep moving. Supplies remain expensive. Space is useful. A harsh world does not often allow lingering ceremonies for the merely disappointed. Still, the emotional effect is real. Every departure whispers that not all stories here end in triumph. Some end in recalculation. Some in debt, some in a quieter, more exhausted sort of wisdom. And the longer you stay, the more names you collect in that category. Men who were sure, men who lasted, men who joked through supper, men who swore they only needed one more week. Then suddenly they are loading a cart or selling tools or talking too brightly about another valley with real prospects. There is also the painful fact that leaving does not always mean escape. Many who departed one camp simply entered another version of the same struggle. New diggings, new prices, new mud, new boastful liars, same sore back. The frontier often sold movement as renewal. Sometimes it was merely repetition with a different creek name, yet hope is wonderfully vulnerable to geography. Change the landscape and people permit themselves fresh belief. By late afternoon, you watch one more outfit head off along the road, wheels catching in ruts, mule tail swishing a bundle tied poorly, and then retied the whole procession, wearing that unmistakable look of people who are trying to appear purposeful while carrying disappointment inside the wagon with the cookware. Dust rises behind them. The camp watches for a moment, then turns back to its own business. Picks resume, pots boil. A card game begins, smoke drifts. Life closes over the departure almost at once, and that may be the most honest thing the camp ever does. It reminds you that no single miner matters much to the larger machine. People arrive, people dream, people ache, people leave. The camp persists until the gold thins, the costs rise, or another rumour pulls the human tide elsewhere. Your own presence here, which feels so total from the inside, is part of a flow much bigger and less sentimental than your private hopes. So when evening settles and the air cools over the scarred ground, you find yourself thinking not only about the people who remain, but about all the people already gone. Those who sold out, those who drifted, those who chased the next whisper, those who limped away with stories' debts and one or two glittering traces in a pouch. The road out of camp is crowded with unfulfilled versions of the self, and perhaps that's the real inheritance of the gold rush. Not only the few who stayed long enough to profit, but the many who left carrying scars, caution, and just enough memory to make the whole ordeal sound almost worth it when told by a winter fire. By the time you have lived long enough in the camp to stop flinching at the morning coughs, the muddy boots by the fire, the endless negotiations over beans, timber, blankets and luck, you also stop asking the simplest question the way you did at the beginning. At first, the question was always how much gold is here. Now it becomes what did this place cost? That change matters. It means the camp has finally done what camps like this always do. It has shifted your gaze away from the glitter and toward the ledger beneath it, the one not kept in a storekeeper's notebook or a banker's safe, but written across bodies, tempers, families, landscapes, and whole communities. Gold Rush life sells itself as a gamble with a shining prize at the end. Yet the deeper truth, the one you can only see after enough dawns in cold canvas and enough evenings in smoke, is that the prize was never simple. Even when people won, they often paid in forms no assay office could weigh. That part is easy to miss when history gets told too briskly. The classic image of a gold rush is all energy and opportunity, men surging toward fortune towns, appearing overnight, commerce blooming, new routes, opening, new fortunes made. All of that did happen. Gold rushes did transform regions, accelerate migration, attract global populations, expand markets and create entirely new urban and rural networks with astonishing speed. That is a central fact of the age. But transformation is not the same thing as kindness. A force can be creative and ravenous at once. The camp as you now know in your bones was both. You look around differently now. The tents and shacks no longer read as rough adventure. They read as strain made visible. Every patched sleeve, every limping gait, every pair of hollow eyes by a cook fire, every handwritten notice curling off a board, every tired joke in the line for coffee, every silence after mail call, all of it forms a quieter account of the rush. This was not just a place where men sought gold. It was a place where people tested the edges of what the human body and the human spirit could absorb without splitting. For many, the cost was physical first. Back injuries that lingered, hands altered by work until gentler tasks felt foreign, lungs roughened by dust and damp, skin burned, cracked or scarred, knees that no longer trusted slopes, teeth lost to neglect, infection or frontier dentistry, which was not a field famous for easing a person's nerves. Plenty of miners did not perish in some dramatic collapse or flood. They simply wore down. They went from eager to tired, from tired to strained, from strained to diminished. In small increments the camp treated as ordinary, because it had no time to treat them otherwise. And then there was the cost to hope itself. A mining camp runs on expectation the way a furnace runs on fuel. It needs a people to believe tomorrow may redeem today. Without that, the whole enterprise sags. But hope used too hard for too long becomes something else. It gets brittle. Men start bargaining with probability, mistaking persistence for destiny, treating every setback as a temporary misunderstanding between themselves and fortune. One especially odd and revealing habit in some camps was the constant saving of lucky objects long after they had clearly failed at the advertised task. A bent spoon, a certain hat, a stone from a first claim, a particular tin cup. These things survived not because they worked, but because people needed proof that their earlier faith had not been entirely foolish. The camp charged emotional interest on every dream. It charged homesickness. It charged loneliness. It charged the humiliation of public failure and the private dread of becoming one more man who came west loudly and left quietly. It charged relationships too. Wives waited, parents worried, children aged, lovers lost patience, families received letters full of optimism, omission, requests, excuses, and just enough truth to keep concern alive. A gold rush did not merely move bodies across a map, it stretched attachments until some held and some snapped, and the camp's social cost spread wider still. It rewarded a few frustrated many and sorted people through systems that were never neutral. Race, nationality, language, capital, gender, access to networks, and sheer timing all shaped outcomes. Some groups were taxed, excluded, or violently pushed aside. Others found ways to thrive despite hostility. Women built businesses and domestic order in places that tried to reduce them to symbols. Immigrant communities formed support systems while facing suspicion. Indigenous land and lifeways were disrupted, displaced or trampled under the entire enterprise, a truth the camp itself seldom paused long enough to acknowledge. If the rush promised open opportunity, the reality arrived with gatekeeping already backed. There is a serious scholarly question about whether gold rushes should be remembered mainly as engines of democratic possibility or as accelerators of inequality and dispossession wrapped in the language of freedom. You can see why that question endures. People really did reinvent themselves in these places. New social arrangements really did emerge, but the freedom on offer was unevenly distributed, and the extraction of wealth from the land often went hand in hand with the extraction of stability from those living on it or beneath it. Progress in the frontier style could be energetic and deeply unfair at the same time. The land itself paid too. That is another truth easy to soften if you stand too far away from the diggings, but you have stood close enough to see hills carved open, riverbanks, stripped trees cut for fuel and timber, slopes destabilized water, diverted mud moved gullies deepened, and the calm logic of a landscape interrupted by frantic human appetite. Even before later industrial methods intensified the damage, early mining camps were already redrawing the ground to suit urgency. The earth was treated as a vault to be cracked open fast, not a home to be understood slowly. You notice too how the camp consumes not just the obvious victims of hardship, but the people who appear to succeed. A merchant profits, yes, but often by tying his fortunes to instability debt, transport risks, theft, and fragile supply lines. A saloon owner grows rich serving loneliness. A boarding house keeper earns well by feeding exhaustion. A miner who strikes big may gain wealth and lose peace, privacy, or the ability to stop chasing. Even victory here often comes with a tremor in it, as if the camp has trained everyone to distrust good fortune for fear it may only be passing through. Perhaps that is why memory of these places becomes so slippery afterward. Former miners, traders, cooks, wives, teamsters, and drifters often look back with a blend of pride, regret, exaggeration and longing that makes perfect sense once you have been here. How else do you narrate a time when you were filthy, hungry, frightened, overworked, and yet more alive to possibility than ever before? How do you admit that it was terrible without denying that part of you loved the scale of the risk? A rush compresses life. Every sensation grows louder. Every plan feels urgent. Memory naturally keeps some glow around that intensity, even when the facts remain stern. As night falls over the camp, you hear the old sounds again, though softer now in your understanding. The clink of a tin cup, the low talk near a fire, a distant laugh, someone coughing in the dark, a horse shifting its weight, canvas moving with the breeze. Beneath those sounds lies the larger quiet you could not hear. At first, the quiet accounting of all that has been spent here. Labour youth, certainty, tenderness, treason and riverbanks, marriages, teeth, illusions, and all those thousands of mornings people handed over to the chance that one day might finally gleam. And then, because even the hard place can look gentle in the last light of the camp settles, the smoke thins into blue ribbons, lanterns glow through canvas and gaps in rough boards, blankets are shaken out, boots are set aside. The creek, which has watched all this with cold patience, keeps moving through the dark as if it never promised anyone anything. A few men still talk about tomorrow's prospects, a few have stopped talking about tomorrow at all. Most lie somewhere in between, too tired to hope loudly, too human not to hope at all. And you, standing at the edge of the whole long experience, finally understand the title. The camp never wrote over its own gate. What life was really like here was not adventure with better marketing. It was endurance. It was noise and hunger and absurd prices. It was dirt under the nails and steam from wet socks by the fire. It was letters from home folded thin with rereading. It was envy of luck, suspicion of strangers, gratitude for coffee, reverence for dry blankets, arguments over inches of ground, and faith placed in Pan's prayers and pure stubbornness. It was a global crowd gathered in mud to test whether hope could be beaten into metal. For a few, perhaps it could. For most, the camp asked more than it ever returned. And now at last the pace begins to soften. The fires burn lower. The lantern light blurs a little at the edges. The sharpness of the day loosens its grip, and the camp that has seemed so loud, so demanding, was so endlessly alive with appetite and worry, begins to recede into gentler shapes. You can let it do that now. You can let the rough boards and canvas walls blur into shadow. Let the voices drift farther apart. Let the clang of tools and arguments and hungry ambition fade under the easier sound of evening air moving over tired ground. You no longer need to follow every rumour downstream or listen for every footstep near a claim marker. You no longer need to count coins under lantern light or wonder whether tomorrow's gravel will finally answer all the questions the earth has kept to itself. The creek goes on quietly without asking anything from you. The hills rest in darkness. Even the smoke which seemed to cling to everything here lifts at last and thins into the night. Perhaps that is the kindest way to leave this place. Not in triumph, not in bitterness, but in understanding. The camp was real. The hardship was real. The people were real too. Hopeful, foolish, brave, lonely, greedy, generous, and tired in all the ordinary human ways. They came seeking brightness in the ground and found instead the full weight of weather labour, chance and longing, and still they endured for one more dawn and then another. So let the camp grow quieter now. Let the muddy paths dim. Let the last fire settle into red coals. Let the boots rest by the flap. Let the blanket finally feel warm. Somewhere in the dark the creek keeps moving over stone patient and silver and soft, carrying away the noise of the day. The stars above the camp do not judge, they simply shine. And under that calm light all the roughness eases for a moment, all the striving slows, all the old hunger loosens its hold. You can rest here now, just outside the reach of the noise, while the camp sleeps and the long, hard story folds itself into silence. Sweet dreams.